नमस्कार। साहित्य अकादमी के वेबलाइन साहित्य श्रृंखला के अंतर्गत आयोजित आज के परिसंवाद में आप सभी का हार्दिक स्वागत है। मित्रों, यह परिसंवाद असमिया भाषा परामर्श मंडल के संस्तुति के अनुरूप आयोजित किया गया है और इसका विषय है इतिहास और साहित्य। आज के इस परिसंवाद में हमारे साथ हैं अकादमी में असमिया भाषा परामर्श मंडल के संयोजक डॉक्टर ध्रुवज्योति बोरा जी। इसके साथ ही हमारे साथ हैं डॉक्टर नंदना दत्ता, डॉक्टर रजीउद्दीन अकील, डॉक्टर राखी कलिता मोरल, डॉक्टर राजेंद्र सैकिया और डॉक्टर चंदन कुमार शर्मा। साहित्य अकादमी की तरफ से आप सभी का हार्दिक स्वागत है, अभिनंदन है। साथ ही हमारे साथ जो भी दर्शक जुड़े हुए हैं, जो श्रोता जुड़े हुए हैं यूट्यूब के माध्यम से या फिर साहित्य अकादमी की वेबसाइट पर जो हमारा लाइव का लिंक है वहां के माध्यम से, उन सभी का भी हार्दिक स्वागत करता हूं, अभिनंदन करता हूं। आप सभी जानते हैं कि जो हमारा इतिहास है, इतिहास के संदर्भों का, इतिहास के परिप्रेक्ष्य का, इतिहास की कथाओं का उपयोग साहित्य में, नाटक में, उपन्यास में, कविता कहानी में किया जाता रहा है। और साथ ही इसका उलट भी हुआ है कि इतिहासकारों ने जो प्राचीन साहित्य है उसको पढ़ते हुए उसके माध्यम से इतिहास को सामने लाने का प्रयत्न किया है, उसको इतिहास के स्रोत के रूप में भी देखा गया है। तो आज के इस कार्यक्रम में हमारे साथ साहित्य अकादमी के सचिव डॉक्टर के श्रीनिवास राव जी भी मौजूद हैं। मैं उनसे अनुरोध करूंगा स्वागत भाषण के लिए। डॉक्टर के श्रीनिवास राव।
नमस्कार। Esteemed Dr. Dhruvajyoti Boraji, eminent Assamese writer and also the convener of Sahitya Akademi's Assamese Advisory Board, all the scholar participants in this program, and all the friends who are watching this program live in Akademi YouTube channel, my colleague Dr. Devesh, and friends. I'm glad to welcome all of you for this Assamese Symposium on History and Literature. Friends, this is a very important topic for discussion. In the past 4 decades or so, Sahitya Akademi has organized a number of regional and national level seminars on historiography of literature and also regional discussions on the relationship between history and literature. The latter discussions are often language-based and rarely region-wise discussions. For such discussions are determined by the depth and richness of the history and literature of that community, language, and region. When done at national level, many determinants weighing in and playing ancillary roles are factored in. Leaving the past as that it may be, coming to the topic of today's discussion, history and literature have been intertwined from the time when humans started practicing structured expressions. Both history and literature are applicable to all the spheres of human endeavors. For example, there is history of science, history of philosophy, history of a nation or community, history of literature, and so on. In the same way, there is religious literature, economic literature, science literature, and so on. By take cue from Sartre, history is but a dot in literature, while literature is nothing but a dot in history. Yet, both are independent disciplines, impacting and borrowing from each other, even while being part of many other disciplines. That is how deeply both history and literature are intertwined with each other almost inextricably. Yet, we do not focus on this aspect or discuss this very often. That is, despite the purported difference between the focus of each, history intends to record events as accurately as possible, while literature interprets historical or everyday events and the play of imagination is not wrong. So much has been written about the essential difference between history and literature. Before going any further, I would like to state only this much. History is always about the past, whereas literature can be about the past, present, and can include futuristic stories. This one key difference is what makes their relationship more amusing. One of the main characteristics of history is to record the events accurately and represent the happenings of the past for the sake of posterity. To this end, the historians may use any or all of the tools available to them: orality, video, audio, documentation, etc. But not much has been made on the recording aspect of literature. Literature, as a capturing of cultural expressions and natural events, can be a repository of information. For example, during the pandemic of 1918 to 1922, Ahmad Ali's Twilight in Delhi not only provides a narration of horror-filled events as they unfolded, but also contained the commentary. The specialty of literature as a recording device is that it can be capture an event from the past and project it into a futuristic science fiction or fantasy. There is a point of view that literary writers tend to distort reality, whereas historians generally go for accuracy. It may not be true always. For more than half a century, the historical accounts regarding America and Soviet Union during pre-Cold War and Cold War periods were driven mostly by propaganda rather than actual accounts, not only in the modern times, but from the ancient and the medieval times. Historical accounts at times were dictated by the authoritarian kings and queens. I'm not saying literary writers do not distort reality. Of course, many times the creative writers tend to portray imaginary characters and plots even when writing a story or post inspired by the real events. Reasons could be many. But one thing that need enhanced attention is the amount of oral literature making up for accounts. In the West, while scrutinizing historical accounts at least, orality is completely ignored. Luckily for us, much of our literature, including historical literature, was written till 150 years ago, and even now what is happening in the communities far removed from the mainstream academia and media is not part of history. So oral literature forms the important aspect of both history and literature. Treating literature or history only a study of written work will take one away from the reality, and it is such as approach that can be called tribal, or as Bankim Chandra Chatterjee would have said, or Prachin Ponthi are backward looking. I'm sure the participants of this symposium will present various aspects related to Assamese literature and Assamese history. I sincerely hope this symposium benefits one and all. With these few words, I'm glad to welcome all of you once again. Thank you all.
Thank you.
धन्यवाद डॉक्टर राव जी। और मित्रों, अब मैं आरंभिक वक्तव्य के लिए डॉक्टर ध्रुवज्योति बोरा जी को आमंत्रित करना चाहूंगा। डॉक्टर ध्रुवज्योति बोरा जी असमिया भाषा के प्रतिष्ठित कथाकार हैं और साथ ही साथ इतिहास से संबंधित आख्यान भी उन्होंने लिखे हैं, पुस्तकें उन्होंने लिखी हैं इतिहास को लेकर के। उनकी 2 दर्जन से अधिक पुस्तकें प्रकाशित हैं और आप साहित्य अकादमी पुरस्कार सहित अनेक पुरस्कारों से सम्मानित हैं। अभी हाल ही में असमिया की प्रतिष्ठित पत्रिका गरियसी मासिक के आप संपादक नियुक्त हुए हैं। इसके लिए आपको बधाई देते हुए आपको आमंत्रित कर रहा हूं आरंभिक वक्तव्य के लिए। डॉक्टर ध्रुवज्योति बोरा।
Thank you, Devesh ji. First of all, let me express my thanks to Dr. Rao who is not only an organizer but an intellectual stimulator par excellence. And he is loved and respected by writers all over our country. And Chandan Sharma, like my brother from Dibrugarh University, who is a good writer and a very excellent historian. And all the participants who are participating in this symposium today. You know, this particular subject, history and literature, is very close to my heart. It is possibly because I am a creative writer, a novelist, and my themes that I write upon are mostly society and people, and especially during changes of historical nature which occur. So for me as a writer, there is no escape from history. At the same time, I am a student who dabbles in history, tries to write certain things, popular histories, as well as historical studies of my state and my people. So being both at the same time, a creative writer and a student of history, I think gives me a perspective of the interrelationship between history and literature. Now, history, as we all know, is usually written by the powers that are current or by victors, one who have won in the societal and political race of a particular time and particular country. So in this history, the common people, one who have been defeated and one who have been pushed to the backwards, usually do not find their voice. Especially so, the marginalized and subaltern sections of our society, they hardly have any voice in the whole historical discourse. Therefore, history leaves many spaces for imagining it, reimagining it, and trying to get into the depth of the things that might have happened, that have actually happened in the society. In this endeavor, the novel plays a great role. You cannot understand history without the novel. And without history, there can be no great novels also. Now, I usually give a very fond example. So can you imagine the reality, the harsh reality, and also the effect of the Napoleonic Wars on the society of Russia without reading War and Peace of Tolstoy? I think that is not possible. That particular novel gives us a panoramic overview and also deep insight into the whole process of war and peace and its effect of on the common population. Therefore, literature is about, basically, it inquires the condition of existence of man. The conditions under which a man in a particular society exists. That is the basic source of any serious literary work, be it a novel, be it a short story, even a poem. It concerns itself about this particular human existence. But the human existence cannot be in a void or a limbo. It is situated in a particular time, at a particular place, and in a society to which this human experience is rooted. Now, literature delves into these aspects, which traditional history cannot or do not go into. It is not its field. So, in situating the human in time, space, and society, literature plays the role or starts its role from the point where history has left it. So together, it gives us a more complete picture of the whole world, of incidences, of happenings, of human existence. My own works, for example, my latest work, Ajar, which Chandan has very beautifully reviewed. It's about the Kalajar epidemic, which started from the early 30s to about 45 or so, and during its travel through the society of Assam, it has devastated. It was a pandemic like which there was none before. There are occasions where cholera have created havoc. Malaria has decimated populations, but people dying in droves in streets, in their homes, such kind of pandemic were never experienced in Assam before the Kalajar epidemic came. But my search was something deeper than this simple medical epidemic. Being a medical man, a professional doctor, I am at a little advantage in depicting this medical aspect of this epidemic or pandemic, but its social aspects. The pandemics do not happen in vacuum. There is a lot that precedes it. Failure of government, failure of the state to protect the health and well-being of its subjects, the anarchy which does not allow things to happen in the society, all these things do have a telling effect on the pandemics that happen. If you compare that old pandemic to the one we are having now, you will be able to realize the human errors, the failure in government, the failure in the various aspects that have led to this situation. So my novel starts from an era which is much before the pandemic, when the civil war and foreign invasions devastated the state of Assam and have created the right conditions of anarchy and governmental failure, administrative failure, which led to this kind of a pandemic that cannot be dealt with. And moreover, we had that by that time, the colonial administration, which was never concerned with the welfare of the common people, but were mostly concerned with the administrative, military, and revenue aspects only. How much they can extract out of the people. They were never concerned about the welfare of the people, of protecting the people. And at the same time, they have devastated the state by opening up the virgin forests, cutting them down, and opening up a plantation economy, colonial plantation economy, which have also caused great changes. So in this background, this pandemic of Kalajar arrived. And through the experience of a family, I have tried to depict the various devastating effects that it had. So my purpose of saying this is that my story and the protagonists of the story are situated in a historical reality, but the story speaks of things which history has not recorded. How the common people have behaved. What were their fears? What were their hopes? And what efforts did they take in the face of this pandemic to save themselves? How they have died in droves. So similarly, my other major works are also situated in a historical context on which the stories develop and attain their legitimacy as well as attain their literary, I would say, completion. So the whole purpose of history and literature and their interrelationship is something which is very, very close and very, very important. I believe no sincere writer, no sincere novelist or a poet or a short story writer can fully detach himself or herself from history and historical experience of our people, of the society they are writing about. So this great interrelationship is something I feel the authors must pay great attention to and try to imbibe as much of the history as possible to write better, more logical, and a more satisfying literary work. With these words, I welcome all the participants, and I hope that today's deliberations will shed lights from the various angles on this beautiful subject of history and literature. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dhruvajyoti Boraji. Friends, now may I request Dr. Nandana Dutt for his paper. Nandana Dutt is Professor of English at Guwahati University, Assam. Her areas of work include Assam and modernity, English literature, American studies, women studies, and the politics of representations. She has published essays in journals such as Global South, Journeys, Interventions, Journal of Contemporary Thought, Journal of Creative Communication, Seminar, and Australian Literary Studies, besides contributing essays to edited collections on Assam identity and violence. She is also the author of Questions of Identity in Assam and editor of the work Communities of Women in Assam, Being, Doing and Thinking Together. Dr. Nandana Dutt. Madam, please unmute. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be on this eminent panel. And as a literary scholar, I must express my deep admiration of the talk given by Dr. Bora before proceeding with my submission. I'm obviously going to have a much less imaginatively rich talk than Dr. Bora's. And I must apologize at the start that this is going to be a very, something which comes up out of my own disciplinary limitations and disciplinary location. And therefore, maybe it will obviously not have the richness of Dr. Bora's talk. I'll give my examples from, not from Indian or Assamese literature, but from African American literature, mainly because that is the area in which I am working at the moment. And I'm writing a literary history of African American literature for a publisher, Indian publisher. So my area at the moment is this. So I'm going to talk about this. We, at the entrance of the New Arts building of Guwahati University that houses English, Bengali, Hindi, and Arabic departments, there's a statue of the historian S.K. Bhuiyan, who began his career as a teacher of English at Cotton College. And we speak with pride of the literary quality of his historical works. Equally fascinating is the career of Jadunath Sarkar, who taught English for much of his career while becoming famous as a historian of the Mughal era. Recently, while teaching a poem by Jayant Mahapatra, The Abandoned British Cemetery at Balasore, I found myself exploring two historical elements from the poem. The history of Balasore as an early British settlement in Orissa dating back to 1634, and the epidemic of cholera in Balasore jail in 1866. For the latter, I shared with my students two documents, a report on the two outbreaks of the disease at the Balasore jail and an article from Modern Asian Studies on cholera in early 19th century India. Both of them historical documents. These helped to provide an occasion for the poem and also explained why there should be a British cemetery there. This is only a very small instance of what we habitually do when we read a literary text for teaching or for a research paper. We look for the historical markers the text might contain and then follow these up in historical work. A number of assumptions are frequently cited that surprise us as literary scholars because of how dated they are with regard to what happens in literary studies today, that literature reflects history, that literature might sometimes be a historical source, albeit a somewhat unreliable one, that history deals with facts and literature deals in the domain of the imagination. Such assumptions are unaware of the diverse ways in which a literature is situated in its historical context, defined as time, place, society, circulation of ideas, relationships within and relationships with others outside, aesthetic ideas, forms of communication during the period studied, and so on. The historical sense underscores how we look at the development of literary forms or genres, the biography of a writer, the history of an age. In what follows, I will speak of the disciplinary relationship through a number of examples, and then go on to speak of literary history and briefly reflect on literary production. So my first section, as a literature student, critic, scholar encounters history in the form of its material on texts, genres, and authors taken from a historical period, in the shape of and chronological ordering of its literary histories, and in the interface between historiography and narrative theory. Concerns like this bring us to the question of interdisciplinarity. How does one discipline borrow from or work with another? Is it only a borrowing of findings or raw material, or is it also a conceptual methodological engagement? Much of what I say here in this section is set around these questions. I recall now that as a PhD scholar, my methodological readings included E.H. Carr's What is History, Collingwood's The Idea of History and the Historical Imagination, and predictably for a literary scholar, Hayden White's Meta-History, Content of the Form and Tropics of Discourse, as well as an essay called The Value of Narrativity in History. Alongside, I was also reading, because my area was American literature, I was also reading histories of America as well as histories of American literature. The interest generated through these readings took me to the stages of history writing in modern India, and especially to subaltern studies that has become such an important methodological choice for literary critics today. Most of our students like to work with subaltern studies as a method in their literary studies. One can also list the numerous new phases in world history where research has been equally into the event and the literature. World wars, the Nazi Holocaust, partition, US interventions in different parts of the world, and their long-term effects. For literature students, the literature produced during and in the wake of these events has been a way of learning two very important things: the absolute necessity to acquire historical information, and the consequent knowledge helping to open up and explain why literature of a particular kind has resulted from the impact. So the content, the form, and aesthetic devices with which to represent physical and emotional trauma in such situations, these are all things that work together. The interface between the two disciplines appears more and more often and has almost become a given, especially as we open up the material with which we do our research in both disciplines. If you have a Pierre Nora in history, we have a Stephen Greenblatt in literature, widening the scope of what might constitute historical and literary sources. A recent book by a Stanford historian, Priya Satya, Time's Monster, History, Conscience, and Britain's Empire, on the historical imagination and colonialism, begins with a sentence: Historians are storytellers, custodians of the past, repositories of collective memory, poetic interpreters of what is to be a human. This is a historian writing. These are sentiments that one might find in one form or another in works of literary criticism or literary history. The material this book uses includes Adam Smith, who is often seen as a sort of progenitor of literary studies, in the development of English studies, romantic poetry, including a reading of Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Urdu poetry, Sahil Ludhianvi and Faiz Ahmed Faiz, to give a random sample of the kind of material that the scholar has used. The journal Literature and History in its website describes itself as concerned to investigate the relations between writing, history, and ideology, and is a forum for practitioners coming from different vantage points in both disciplines. And you have essays like Causing Misery and Suffering Miserably, representations of the 30 Years' War in Literature and History, or Authors and Artemus Jones, Libel Reform in England, 1910 to 1952, as sample essays in these volumes. So all these borrowings, these are still borrowings, you might think, but also intense efforts to forge closer disciplinary relationships, constantly striving to find those vital points of contact where each is enriched because of and with the other. So one of the important critics that we read a great deal of in literature is Hayden White. And Hayden White uses a term, novelesque history. In an interview, he said this in 2015, and his examples were Toni Morrison's Beloved, John DeLillo's Underground, and Philip Roth's American Pastoral. In the course of his interview, suggesting that history and literature are similar because they are both forms of artistic writing, different from ordinary speech or language because of their use of certain devices, tropes, and thematizations. This aspect of a particular kind of writing is what is most interesting for us, as it is on this ground that we begin to see the enmeshing of the two disciplines, their integral relationship, and at least for literature, that we cannot do without the other. My second section is on literary history, coming from an area that, as I said, I'm working on at the moment. The most vigorous and clear exchange and relationship between the two disciplines for literature scholars happens in the field of literary history. How did a literary text or a literature, a national literature, actually come to be? How did the writer come to write it? Why does it speak of some things and not of others? Why does a genre predominate a period? And of existing literary histories, we might ask, why does it not mention many other writers who were also writing? Why did earlier histories ignore women writers, writers of color, writers from disadvantaged communities? So we are concerned with the writing of such writers, creating meaning by ordering and shaping stories about texts and contexts while maintaining a sense of chronological development. This is what most literary histories do. Most of these questions and concerns came together while planning and beginning to write a literary history of African American literature, where I initially read two books. One was a history of the African American people. The second was an 800-page volume of American literary history, a collection of essays on various aspects of this history. The parallel readings were essential because the project demanded knowledge of the slave trade and of the institution of slavery in the US, the forced merger of diverse African ethnic groups from which people were captured and enslaved and forced into a single African American identity, new forms of verbal expression, which are the consequence of contact among Africans, indigenous peoples, and Europeans, and so on. So all of they show the importance of historical grounding for a project that eventually will weave all of these into the story of African American literature. As thinking on literary history has shown, economic, political, and broader cultural and social perspectives on issues like race or gender must be brought to bear in the construction of any literary history today in a different way than in the past. African American history writing in recent years has shown interest in several key areas: transnationalism and mobility. These are the two that I identify at the moment, tracing back to origins in several regions of Africa. Dr. Bora mentioned the importance of the oral in cultures like ours. It's very similar in the African American situation, where much of the literature that we read today that is being produced even in the 21st century owes its origins to many of the oral forms that have continued alongside the written tradition. The question of origins, therefore, has come to be pushed back to the sophisticated oral cultures prevailing among the African tribes from which people were captured and transported to America. Folktale corpuses, the cultures of performance involving call and response, music, and sounds that remained in the memory and were now traced back to their origins. This was a massive process of historical recovery that changed not only how early African American cultural production came to be perceived, but also set the beginnings in a vernacular tradition that was a blend of what remained in memory from the African American phase of lives and what developed in the critical circumstances of their lives in America. The recovery and legitimization of the oral as source and style also now enabled literary interpretations of written literature as integrating aspects of the oral in the rendering of Black speech, for example, but also drawing on folk figures like the trickster and the performative mode called signifying to enrich and distinguish genres like the novel, poetry, and drama. The work of Toni Morrison is probably the single best example of how all of these elements have come together through individual genius. Her work, critiqued and presented by a battery of sophisticated readers, is deeply embedded in the slave past, responsive to continuing forms of racism, and expressive of the uniqueness of African American culture. The second and final point I want to make is about the notion of literary production mentioned earlier. Here, the reading of the past is highly political, and the newer literary histories, one of the most interesting being something called Representing the Race, a new political history of African American literature, came out in 2011, clearly declares that racial representation has long succeeded as an intellectual and cultural genre of political action in African American history. So this is the second point that I thought I would focus on, that literature not only is produced as a result of a lot of history, but it is also something that sometimes can intervene in history, play a kind of ideological role. He also writes, Jarrett writes, of the historical salience of issues like Black empowerment, political self-determination, racial solidarity, and a shared history of racial oppression. All of this historical information running alongside as he picks up writers and critiques them as participating in this history of African American life. I want to end with one final example to demonstrate how new historical findings in the broad field, not immediately related to African American history, but set in the same period and location, can be transformative for the work of literary interpretation. This is a new book of history by a person called Andres Resendes, a historian at the University of California at Davis, called The Other Slavery. It uncovers the long submerged history of Native American enslavement, invisible and long-standing because it was never legalized as slavery and never legally abolished. The publication of these findings is transformative for understanding the ideological basis of earlier literary critical works that ignored the native presence in making claims about American and African American literature. For me, since I'm at the moment reading this area, and especially its frequent recourse to the autobiographical mode, African American literature, as we all know, is very autobiographical, this book stirred my critical imagination as I went back to, in memory, over my reading to those literary texts again and found no mention of this phenomenon of Native American slavery. It made me go back to an old idea that the literature of an oppressed people can be so deeply narcissistic, and we see this in literature coming out of the Holocaust, out of other horrific genocides and instances in world history, deeply narcissistic as to rule out the potential for empathy with the fate of other peoples and races who have had similar experiences. So this gave me a point of entry for a critique about the obsessive obsessive self-focus in much of this literature, a notion of competitive victimhood, to use a term casually thrown out by a friend, now appears as a kind of faint shadow that is likely to interfere and influence readings of this literature. A conceptual question about the politics of literary exclusions might well come back to us. So literature and history, an enriching relationship. Given that we are increasingly faced with the challenge of every new dispensation rewriting the history it teaches to its students and to the larger community, the links between history and literature, especially that histories are, after all, stories of the past, and at a fundamental narrative level, fiction, is possibly the new essential knowledge that we need to familiarize our students with the sly, guerrilla response, if one might use the term. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nandana Datta ji. Now I am requesting Professor Rajivuddin Akil ji. Professor Rajivuddin Akil ji teaches medieval and early modern history in the University of Delhi. He has published widely on religious, literary, and historical traditions in Sultanate and Mughal India. His books include The Muslim Questions, Understanding Islam and Indian History, and Days in the Life of a Sufi, 101 Enchanting Stories of Wisdom. He has also co-edited with Professor Partha Chatterjee History in the Vernacular, with Professor David Curley Literary and Religious Practices in Medieval and Early Modern India, and with Dr. Tilottama Mukherjee and Earthly Paradise, Trade, Politics and Culture in Early Modern Bengal. Professor Rajivuddin Akil ji with his paper.
Thank you very much, sir, and good morning, everyone. I'm glad and grateful that the Sahitya Academy has organized this event on history and literature and invited me to speak on this topic of literary and historical traditions and practices in medieval and early modern India. So I'll be doing a long survey of sorts. Much water has flowed down the Brahmaputra since the time historians and literary scholars would travel in separate boats, as it were, crisscrossing, but never taking each other seriously, sometimes even suspecting each other's credentials. Scholars like Dr. S.K. Bhuiyan were exceptional. Happily, researches and scholarship in the last couple of decades or so have ensured that historians and scholars of literature can now speak to each other comfortably on board the same boat as they can travel together now. Historians are now going beyond their conventional search for hard facts in government files to look for important clues to social and cultural realities of the past in the context of the production of literature and literature itself. They are no longer dismissing literature as mere fictitious imagination of writers and surveying and taking seriously and studying literary masterpieces or even otherwise seemingly unimportant, little and marginalized traditions of writings in regional vernaculars. References to memories of subaltern classes, etc., were made in the previous, presentations. At the same time, literary scholars are also increasingly looking at serious historical writings for the context of literary productions for understanding textual traditions better, realizing texts and contexts are made by each other, reflect on each other, and sort of made for each other, as it were. And there's a circuitous relationship between literature and its social context, society. 19th century produces 19th century kind of literature, 6th century BCE produced 6th century BCE kind of literature. So in sum, it's a happy situation for all scholars of literary and intellectual practices, as in our Indian case, going back to close to 2 millennia now, surveying and studying literature in different languages and in a variety of genres. Contrary to general notions derived from misleading British colonial assumptions since at least early 19th century, India has long and varied literary and historical traditions. Historical works are to be found not only in classical languages, such as Sanskrit, Tamil, and Persian, but also from medieval period onwards in a variety of Indian vernaculars like Assamese and Bengali, Odia, Punjabi, Hindi, Kannada, Malayalam, Marathi, Telugu, and Urdu, among others. Whole different, linguistic geography of Hindustan reveals there are languages, there are literatures in those languages, and there are historical literatures in those languages. So on their part, historians were previously obsessed with Sanskrit for ancient period, Persian for medieval, and English for modern. Such a narrowly framed tripartite division, ancient, medieval, modern history of Indian society and its limited sources are now being reconsidered. The vast corpus of Indian historical literature might be divided on the basis of languages or presented in a whole range of genres. They eventually acquired the somewhat secondary status as important sources of traditions and history. But here I am also emphasizing on the value of parts of this literature as historical texts in themselves. A large part of historical literature on the basis of its writing style alone merits the label of being history in its own right. Historical writings such as Itihas or Itihasa, Puranas, Vanshavali, Kulaji, Charit, Buranji in Assam is a vast corpus since the home period. Bakha in the Maratha country, Khayat in Rajasthan, and Tarikh since the medieval period, Persian Tarikh, might be replete with myths and legends. They might not pass the test of veracity of historical truth or might not be strictly chronological, yet they present sufficiently large examples of historical consciousness and traditions in India going back to early medieval period, going back to the beginning of the first millennium of the Common Era. Just because they are different in style and language, say Sanskrit and poetry, and different therefore from modern Western historical method, they should not be dismissed as altogether ahistorical. These are historical texts and historical writings and show historical traditions and consciousness and clearly identifiable historiography. Some accomplished historians have been surveying and studying a variety of literature in many languages across time and space. These include classical languages as well as a number of regional vernaculars, as I mentioned previously, though in many cases the boundaries of classical and vernacularities as well as forms and genres collapse. And therefore it is possible that there is a work of literature which is also historical in the sense that it has a texture of the past, as Velcheru Narayan Rao, David Shulman, and Sanjay Subramaniam have mentioned in their excellent work on early modern, Deccan and Southern India. I'm also remembering here an important early collection of essays edited by C.H. Phillips called Historians of India, Pakistan, and Ceylon, published early in the 1960s, which surveys whole range of literature produced in India, historical literature produced in India from very ancient times to modern times. Together, they reveal interesting ways in which literary works were produced, show how authors and reading publics resorted to intertextual cross-referencing, and also understood the distinction between history and fiction. History is a form of literature, but it is not fiction. And the reading public would understand the distinction between historical and non-historical literature. Current research also indicates the direction the emerging new literary histories can take for a more fruitful understanding of India's vast literary traditions, especially how its past has shaped the present. Historically, cultural diversity epitomizes India's civilizational character, and that is well put together, articulated in its vast literature. Some key historical texts show enough light on this. They include many interesting versions of the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, in Sanskrit and vernaculars throughout the subcontinent. The Sikh scripture Adi Granth or Guru Granth Sahib, which comprises devotional compositions not only of Sikh gurus but also of such iconoclasts such as Sant Kabir and Punjabi Chishti Sufi Sheikh Farid, Baba Farid, besides those of other bhaktas of the past, together revealing the creation of a public that was soaked in bhakti traditions of divergent kind and striving to coexist peacefully in a political environment in which regimes do not discriminate and pit them against each other. So there is a coexistence of a wide variety of literature, including religious literature. Example may also be given here of a text like Padmavat of Malik Muhammad Jayasi, which was in the news in recent past for making a film on that text. And it is a fine example of Sufi poetry of love in Hindi in a genre called the Premakhyan. Sufi poetry of love called Premakhyan, and Padmavat, Apravat, and quite a few Madhumalti, quite a few interesting texts of the Premakhyan variety are available to us from the 14th century in Hindi, older Hindi, and in other recensions. Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas is a powerful expression of Ram Bhakti in Mughal India, and Akbarnama and Aine Akbari of Abul Fazl, articulating Mughal political ideology on how to govern a vast subcontinental country with so much diversity, especially for resolving the question of religious assertions through emphasis on broad-based governing principles conceptualized as peace with all. Together, the literary and historical masterpieces showcase what is cherished as the best in India's inclusive political culture, devotional practices showing the way for peaceful coexistence, and remarkable achievements in the cultural arena, including literary and historical practices on which we have focused our attention here. The long history of history writing in India in Sanskrit, Persian, and the Indian vernaculars reveal interesting ways in which histories have been written and understood across centuries in the period prior to the British rule and even after and into the present, indigenous traditions of historical writings. These histories in Sanskrit, Persian, and vernaculars cannot be placed in separate boxes, because they were appropriating and influencing each other. For Sanskrit, I'm particularly interested to highlight the value of an important genre of historical kavya from medieval Kashmir called the Rajtarangani. Not only Kalhan's famous mid-12th century Rajtarangani, narrativizing history from ancient times down to the poet's own period, but also the very interesting chronicle by Shriva of the reign of 15th century Sultan Zainul Abidin in his Zaina Rajtarangani or Janatarangani, as it is referred to. And these texts are available in print as also in English translation. Similarly, Persian histories of the Tarikh, Tabaqat, or Akhbarat variety are a large corpus, beginning from the time of Turkish inroads led by Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna in early 11th century to the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the early 13th century more properly, and after. That is for close to 6 centuries and up to the period before colonial transformations of the 19th century, a period encompassing what we are calling medieval and early modern eras of India's checkered history. I'm tempted to mention here my own work on the mid-14th century Ziauddin Barani and his Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, along with his book on political ideas called the Fatwa-e-Jahandari. So these are very, very important texts which help us understand the 14th century political resolution of lots of important questions which even concern us in the present. Besides Sanskrit and Persian, the third set of historical literature which I would like to mention are to be found in wide-ranging regional languages across the Indian subcontinent, from around the 14th century to the present. Unable to occupy a center space in the intellectual and political discourses, they flourish in the popular and public domains of the regions. This part of my presentation is informed by some fine piece of research and writing by Professor Partha Chatterjee, with whom I have co-edited this book called History in the Vernacular. In a sister publication, History and the Present, Professor Chatterjee has also discussed historians' response to the postmodernist challenge to the writing of history, which is relevant to our conversation here. That historians are continuously also refashioning themselves with reference to all the forms and contents and other kinds of propositions. A major limitation of vernacular history is that it is used as a weapon in the political struggle for identity based on religion, caste, region, and languages. In these contestations, professional historical research is often set aside, and traditional notions and beliefs are privileged by the custodians of popular sentiments. Vernacular histories feed there. Consequently, unverifiable social memories are often preferred over verifiable historical evidence and facts, and history therefore is misused or sacrificed in the quest for power. That makes history a hot topic as well. On the other hand, despite contradictions between political ideologies and historical reality, as well as other challenges, academic research conducted and emerging from universities, research institutions, and journals has been exploring new frontiers within the contours of history as a professional discipline. So 19th century history was for 19th century consumption, 20th century history was for 20th century demands, and now in the 21st century, in the last couple of decades, we see history writings have been meeting the challenges from the contemporary times, and therefore refashioning and changing and exploring newer fields and answering new questions. Relevant historical questions are analyzed on the basis of evidence and its authenticity, validation and corroboration. Even though social and political context of historians, their language, theoretical models and assumptions determine historical interpretations and narratives, credible professional historians are expected to maintain objectivity and eschew biases and prejudices to be able to maintain what we call historical distance for us to be recognized as, as speaking in terms which is perhaps more acceptable. This is surely for writing history aimed at explaining what exactly happened in the past and why. Assuming that the past is a different and lost country that cannot be reconstructed in its entirety, scholars are at least offering interesting new perspectives, if not absolute truth. Tell exactly what happened in the past is no longer entirely, possible. So maybe different interesting perspectives can be offered on which there can be consensus among historians and literary scholars and other interested parties, as it were. Indeed, contemporary trends in historical research show that a lot of progress has been made in recent decades. Basing on a variety of sources in different languages and genres, interesting new research is being conducted on politics, religion, visual cultures, performance, gender, caste, identity, and regional aspirations, which we are often confronted with politically as well. Much of the cutting-edge research is in English with international discursive engagements. As mentioned previously, and to an extent in continuation with pre-colonial forms of history writing, modern histories are also being produced in languages such as Bengali, Malayalam, and Marathi, Assamese, but their standard is generally not at par with English, unfortunately. The situation is far worse in North India, where teaching and researches in Hindi is considered infra dig. And for a language such as Urdu, problems are compounded by political and communal overtones. I'm reminded here of the fine study of the classical Hindi literature of the Mughal period by Alison Bush. Time permitting, I would have gone into some details of my recent research on Mughal poets, such as Jafar Zatali, Nazir Akbarabadi, and Mirza Ghalib, for a more informed historical analysis of their literary compositions. Previous generations of historians were not looking at popular Urdu poets seriously enough. Urdu histories with their pre-colonial roots were similarly marginalized. I'm coming towards the concluding part of my presentation. Looking more generally, vernacular histories tend to serve as fodder for popular debates and politics than contributing to the production of knowledge in any significant manner. There might be exceptions, but this is unfortunately often the case in terms of professional history writing in our academic institution. Since academic institutions cannot remain isolated from social and political activities in their surroundings, subjects of research and teaching are also influenced by their contemporary context, and yet historians are expected to maintain critical distance, objectivity, credibility, etc. Distinction. Despite different kinds of challenges, historians and literary scholars have been able to do interesting new research, often in conversation with each other and sometimes from their own distinct disciplinary stances. Scholars of allied disciplines in the social sciences and humanities, political science, anthropology, economics, sociology, bring in their own expertise and results of their research. This interdisciplinary research and writing, by scholars who themselves are rooted in their respective disciplines, present as a very, very interesting kind of proposition, insights, and possibilities of a larger holistic understanding of things which were otherwise not possible from narrow disciplinary framework often. Together and separately, scholars have pushed frontiers of research and knowledge production on a scale that matches the best in the world of contemporary global scholarship in respective fields. And I think I will stop now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajivuddin Akil ji. Friends, now may I request Dr. Rakhi Kalita Moral. Dr. Rakhi Kalita Moral is currently Head Center for Women's Studies and Associate Professor of English at Cotton University, where she has taught for 25 years. Her present research interests lie at the intersections of gender, conflict, Northeast India, and literary cultural theory. A former fellow with Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, she has been known widely for her work on women in security in the Northeast and has published in both national and international journals, including books at the Frontier and Beyond, and Gender and Society in Northeast India, and Women, Peace and Security in Northeast India, among others. Dr. Moral was a visiting faculty with the Center for the Study of Social Systems, JNU, in 2016, and has most recently been awarded with the Viscount Sahas Prerna Award for her work in gender equity and gender justice in the higher education campuses in India. Dr. Rakhi Kalita Moral with her paper.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to convey and express my deep gratitude for being invited to this panel today and for the honor of being part of Sahitya Akademi's Symposium on Literature and History. I thank the Secretariat and I'm indeed also very deeply impressed by the two presentations that have gone before mine, both Professor Nandana Datta and Professor Rajivuddin Akil's scholarly accounts of how history negotiates with literature and the outcome of that, which is the production, production of both knowledge and the production of literature as very deep-standing, long-standing, permanent contributions from regions that we are talking about. And in this section of Sahitya Akademi's symposium, I would like to talk from my own location, but with the disclaimer that as also, for being a scholar of literary studies and for having taught literature, my own engagement with texts from the region will obviously present the understanding that I have as someone who not only reads literatures, but who tries to make sense of how history and literature participate with each other and are entangled, always unfailingly entangled. Nandana Datta earlier has already deliberated on the question of writing literary histories. And it's all important and the all important genre of literary history, especially in the academic engagements of literary scholars. And I shall probably not dwell on that for too long, although I will have a few comments to make on that. She has also given a very impressive account and a self-reflexive account of doing history in literature, something that we are all guilty of, and we all participate in literature departments everywhere. Professor Akil too has mentioned, and I must make this comment, that he has also mentioned that vernacular histories of our region often feed on narratives of resistance. And I dare say that my presentation today will make certain forays into that area. And I will have brief glimpses of some of the examples that I can draw from this region. So the question of history in literature and how chronicles can be literary has remained, for the most part, despite constant negotiations, as we've just done, undefined for a very long time now. Between both these disciplines, there is varying opinion about how one ought to recount the past, with a common, if reductionist, view that historians write within their discipline, while historical novelists are not so bound. Further, it probably also seems to be a truism to say that history is a discipline of inquiry, while historical novels are acts of creativity. Now, I'm only summing up what are notions, or rather given ideas, about both the disciplines. Having said that, the increasingly blurred boundaries and intersecting terrains of the two in modern narratives have also made difficult the naming of both. And readers often end up asking if a certain text is history or fiction or even both. And the term historical fiction, once a definitive category, also now running into a somewhat fuzzy ground and assuming an ambivalence of its own. So part of my deliberation today will address this aspect of the practice of writing history and literature. I'm going to draw from a very well-known work, which of course transcends the region. I mean, it's a novel of colonial India, and I'm referring to Amitav Ghosh's 2000 novel, The Glass Palace. I use The Glass Palace as an example from which to make certain important observations on writing fiction through history. So Amitav Ghosh's 2000 novel, based on colonial India and Burma's strange and historical alliance, narrated through the experiences of a family scattered as a consequence of post-imperialist dislocations in various parts of the Asian continent, was, by his own admission, a writing of places and times that forced him to create a wholly fictional world. This is what Ghosh says in his epilogue. Now, the debate over whether history can be fictionalized is pertinent, especially when we speak like this now at the intersections of history and literature, and becomes an interesting academic question that has now come to bear new meanings and significance in our postmodern worlds. Ghosh, of course, did not write of the empire primarily in terms of its policies or practices. Instead, he explored the interactions between the world and the nation, between fact and fiction, creating a novel that took him more than 5 years to write. And The Glass Palace, Ghosh confesses, made him travel thousands of miles, read hundreds of books, memoirs, travel logs, gazetteers, articles and notebooks, both published and unpublished, visiting and revisiting locations and settings that figured in his novel. So Ghosh provided a template, as it were, for the new works of history that were told through the lenses of individual lives or via memories, myths, and even through magical realism. And Ghosh does this in another book, an earlier book on an intrigue of history in an antique land, a story of an Indian slave in faraway Egypt. So while it is a meditation on slavery, and of course the ethical, moral dimensions, aside of the very rich anthropological inquiries, it is part travelogue, part anthropology, and is backed by tons of archival material and information on this 12th century history of India and Egypt, which interestingly is mediated by the author's perambulating presence in both spaces. And this today has easily become one of Ghosh's most read novels. Prescribed in history courses as well as in literature and anthropology classes alike, this is a genre that defies the disciplinary categories and spills out of the limits that we traditionally assign to them in the academy. In his historical essay, landmark essay called Historical Fiction, Fictional Reality, Fictional History and Historical Reality, and I'm referring to Hayden White, historian and critic. Earlier, Nandana Datta had also mentioned him. He addressed this problem of blurring boundaries between history and fiction, something that is the prerogative of modern historians today, who, according to him, no longer need to search in obscure archives for one new document that will authorize the admission of at least one hitherto unknown fact to the normative account, to the narrative of a community's history. This was Rethinking History, in Rethinking History in 2005. In fact, postmodernists are now sometimes even termed anti-historical. But as Hayden White has argued, the new ways of writing history involve the dismantling of these permeable boundaries between reality and what we human beings caught in throes of memory and desire, conscious and unconscious, or subconscious imaginings, knowledge and experience straddle in our understanding of history and our worlds. For as we all know, history and literature are complementary, are both cousins, and not merely in that they are both testaments to man's growth through the centuries, but in that they are products of a common vital urge on the part of human beings to explain tangible forces of life, which in the ultimate sense become the most tangible of motivations. In the historical novel, in the domain of historical novel, George Lukács, Marxist cultural historian, also noted that the novel's referent comes to be seen, whenever the novel's referent comes to be seen as possessing a dynamic in its own right, historicity need no longer be invoked to guarantee the text's representation of that referent. And thus, my message is empowered to interpret and judge historical actuality and distinctness as a mode of the discourse. Thus, the historical novel's separation from non-fictional kinds of writing, such as history and even journalism, signals its adoption of a new view of the historical process, shaping the relation of character to event. Now, the classical form of the historical novel is an epic depicting a transformation of popular life through a set of representations of humankinds whose lives are reshaped by sweeping social forces. Famous historical figures often feature among the dramatis personae, but their roles in the tales remain oblique or marginal. And narratives instead take on middling characters, people of no great distinction, something that earlier Dr. Bora, Dhrupajyoti Bora mentioned, that histories are often written by victors. I mean, that was the standard norm. But you in the modern times, you have histories that are written by the vanquished or by people on the edge, the marginal, the subaltern. And in Ghosh's Glass Palace, the fictional counterpart of such a subaltern is a member of the Rohingyas who have been in the recent decade in the center of global attention for being boat peoples, for being people who have migrated from one land to another without a home of their own, foreigners in alien territories, etc. So the events which unfolded in the Glass Palace became, so to speak, a kind of hybrid history in which it became difficult to separate what was a fictional, imaginative, often lyrical account of this Rohingya nomad, migrant, in the imperial histories of Burma, India, Malaya, etc. Ghosh is also in his Ibis trilogy, the later work on the Opium Wars and the East Asian history of conflict and trade, written with a sense of inheritance of nearly 100 years of colonial history. And the reigning mood of such narratives has been psychohistorical, geopolitical contingencies that lead to the redrawing of international global relations, but somewhere in the middle of these narratives tell in small and assertive ways how the lives of ordinary people also change the conditions of the production of the academic and intellectual knowledge of history in less divided worlds. I come to this with the second section, a brief second section on, since we have a broad window in history on history and literature, it would be nearly impossible to get into a theoretical account of the relationship between the two. But I shall try and explain this through certain glimpses from literary exercises from the region in the late 20th century. An earlier period in the century witnessed the making of the history of a transforming colonial region in the hands of Hujja Kumar Bhuya, preeminent Ahom chronicler. Much has been spoken of him today in reference to history and literature, who wrote of the Burunjis, and as a historian of contemporary Assam notes, he gave new meaning to the idea of Assamese nationality. Bhuya, a professor of English at the oldest institution of higher education in Assam, easily traversed the spaces between history and literature to craft a form of historical literature that clearly had the advantage of an epistolary narrative. He often used letters interspersed with actual conversations of players and protagonists in context. His biographies of famous leaders and statesmen, Lachit Borphukon and others of Ahom history, have passed off as literary classics. Similarly, Ohomia novelist Rajanikanto Bordoloi, Lakshminath Bezborua, Padmanath Gohai Borua, among others, successfully appropriated the past to fill gaps in Assamese literary tradition and the tradition of historicizing the past, which was adopted by Bhuya's own experiments at different genres in telling historical truth. Thus, early Assamese modernity had in many ways closed the gap significantly between history and literature as scholars and writers leveraged the idea of the jati, alternately read as both the nation and the community. Now, the question of the nation and its people have remained paramount in more creative attempts to tell the story of a state in later times during periods of conflict. My work in conflict literature in the Northeast region allows me to draw a few examples from this exercise. And in the region, both literary production as well as historical documentation of crisis in the region has been dominantly witnessed through history writing, which is now intertwined with fictional narratives. In recent histories of violence and of the deep unrest and contestations within the nation state and against it in Assam, particularly in the wake of rebellions by its most notable guerrilla outfit, the Alpha, several works have come to the reader in Assam, framing the contemporary history of the state and the region. Dr. Trupajyoti Bora's own work, the trilogy and the first part, his famous trilogy, the first part of which, Kolantoro Goddo, 1997, the prose of Tempest, and later translated by him as Elegy for the East, told the story of the region from a young journalist's perspective who worked in Guwahati as a correspondent for a national daily, bringing to the ambit the layered narratives of a state in arms from the metropolitan point of view. The heightened optics of a state caught in turmoil and observed from the mainland through the journalist's prism reenacts the subnationalist struggle waged by a section of youth and rebel leaders disillusioned by what is perceived as an unequal and exclusionary politics of the nation state. As a subaltern history, it penetrates those margins that were earlier not traversed and begs an important question about historiography of the region. As opposed to Bora's witness to history and his interlocutor recording the bloodsheds, deaths, rapes, and terror, we have balancing accounts in the same work, a balancing account of an equally fervent longing for peace and meaning among the people. In the same, around the same time in the same decade, in the next decade, Orupa Potongia Kolita's Felani spans a time period which saw several movements and rebellions, sometimes running parallel to each other as ethnic groups increasingly claimed nationhood within or outside the political borders of the Indian state. Featuring the rejected girl child as a central metaphor of abandonment and erasure. So in this long history, in the long story of colonial history, as well as post-colonial history, one has often found gendered accounts. One has often encountered gendered experiences of conflict. And Felani documents several cycles of ethnic violence in Assam's borderlands, with a lens moving away from the centrality of violence towards agents of survival. And so in an answer, perhaps, or in conversation with Nandana's earlier observation about how narcissistic these histories have become, subaltern, marginal histories from the region are sometimes also victimhood histories. But at the same time, I would like to also, in this context, mention an important strand of women's histories that have emerged from the region, apart from the conflict histories, immediate conflict histories. And while I do not suggest that writing by women comes out of the region as a homogeneous literature, there is sometimes the ease of a common language, and in terms of an Anglophone literature that has also come out from the region and can be read as a literature born of the historical exigencies of a post-colonial state, struggling to keep the nation and its attendant experiences and expressions together. And while this, of course, carries the risk of flattening the individual experiences of women who write in a linked language, willingly immersed in Northeast India's Anglophone cultural production of knowledge of their own land and native lives, the larger objective sometimes of such histories of women across spaces, even regional and metropolitan, or for that matter, Asian and Western, is something that needs to be paid attention to. Temshula Au, Naga poet and writer, and someone who has in the past 3 decades been regarded as a seminal voice from the Northeast, observes how women in her tribe appropriate the power of the world, typically invested in males through supernatural agency, in imaginative tales and fictions from her native land. This is from Being a Naga. This she is explained by alluding to Naga oral literatures in which the eponymous female protagonist, Yajangla, for example, destroys her oppressive husband by transforming herself to a beast, and by virtue of which a form of being a form other than human allows her to re-enter the realm of nature. So here, one is also emphasizing the moral, ethical dimension in which women radically reshape relations in and around local histories and with various social and emotional worlds that they inhabit. Clearly, Au argues for inclusion and a reinterpretation of the past, enabling an imaginative and intuitive dialogue with the traditional way of life and collective pasts to create a literature relevant to both the native folk as well as to an universal audience about these inherent linkages. This has striking resemblances, for example, with Native American history, something that Nandana's presentation had cogently referred to, and provokes me to talk about how perhaps environmental history and women's historiographies too straddle this vast canvas of writing that pours out of the rich history of this region. The question to pose here is then, has the traditional history text been supplanted by historical narratives that introduce new ways of reading contemporary eras. In an interesting global phenomenon across literary genres and literary traditions, if African-American histories that write of immigrants' stories, that write of indigenous histories and Native women somehow intersect and interestingly intertwine themselves with the kind of native stories that tribal women from Assam's uplands and the Northeast's hill states often find expression in. And but while they are stories of perhaps marginal and stories of gendered experiences, they are also at the same time, like their African-American or American, Native American counterparts, often also of celebration and self-realization, found, for example, in the lovely poetic works of Joy Harjo, Gloria Andelswa, or even Linda Hogan. So we come back to the question of how does traditional history get supplanted by narratives that have now come to accommodate, that have come to be admitted into our own historical worlds with the echoes of texts and contexts of the past. I come to the third section of a very small and a last section, which brings me to another interesting historical fiction of this troubled period in the state, which I loosely called guerrilla fiction. Mediated by several signifying practices operative among, most dominant among which is the reportage in the press on the ensuing conflict in Assam, which constitutes a dominant narrative on the, of the period. Guerrilla fictions, in more ways than one, have been stratagems of history writing in which the common man or the person in the street is both participant and witness of the events of the time, facilitating the writing of novels and narratives that are camouflaged histories or alternate histories of the state during decades of protracted conflict. In novels that are at once memoirs, fictionalized diaries, or simply history-inspired narratives, socio-historical changes over a launch jury, and the practices and policies employed by state apparatuses coalesce to produce new modalities of subjectivity and politics in what have become zones of exception. Some of these, fashioned as guerrilla fictions, chart the troubled long years of conflict in Assam, notably in works like Barangangan, 2006 by Roktim Horma, which featuring what one literary critic terms the revolutionary as history's ruins, quote unquote. In earlier histories, Parag Das's Sanglot Fenla, a guerrilla diary, casts an ominous glance over the regimes of governmentality and insurgent struggle of those strife-torn decades, but not without the symbolic promise of hope in a dawn with which the novella ends. Several borderland guerrilla experiences have been also turned into novels in the early 2000s in Assam, including Anurag Mohanto's Owling or Jui, or The Confessions of a Former Alpha Cadre by Homodra Gogoi, which is an undisguised account of the decline of the outfit and the particular events and signposts of Alpha's history that made their way into fictions and first-person narratives of the time. In most of these narratives, history is no longer an objective scenario out there, separate and distant. For both the resistance movements and the rebellions and its participants straddle the canvas, each complementing the other as simultaneous players in that self-sailed drama of violence and survival. Fiction and historiography are both used in the accounts and subvert and assert each other as these contemporary narratives unfold. So, in conclusion, history and literature provide intertexts in the novels examined here, but there is no question of a hierarchy implied or otherwise. As Linda Hutcheon, another noted critic of postmodern fiction and historiographic metafiction, observes, they are both part of the signifying systems of our culture. They both make and make sense of our world. I also would, in passing, make quick mentions of Dhrubajyoti Bora's own work, Ajar, a colonial tract of and a rich ethnographic account of Kala Ajar, black sickness, which is mentioned in his introductory address, in the tea gardens around Nagaon, in the fraught decades of the last century. And Dr. Bora's new historical fictional narrative makes a medico-cultural novel of the epidemic through a vast material history of 4 generations of a family, representing social and the emotional repercussions of the disease. Co-opting research with a storytelling mode, Dr. Bora has announced, as it were, the historical novel's new avatar in Assam. Close to these sites of pestilence and disease also, a respectable woman, for example, by Eastereen Kire on the Assam-Nagaland hills or borderlands, once part of undivided Assam, is a wonderful retelling of oral history around the memories of battles fought and families sundered in the war that scarred the Naga hills of yore. This is the site where memory meets history through a blurring of events, but recollected in individual minds through storytelling. So in similar ways, both this one novel about pestilence and disease, the other novel about wars and moments of anguish and anxiety, do converge as new ways of storytelling through fiction, bringing into the ambit of cultural production and literary knowledge histories with a difference. I would like to end by invoking an important voice from the Western world, Walter Benjamin, critic, who's celebrated angel of history, inspired by Paul Klee's painting, Angelus Novus, in his famous thesis on the philosophy of history, a 1940 publication, vividly sketched history as such. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where a chain of events appears before us, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing in from paradise. This is what Benjamin says. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels them into the future to which his back is turned. Unquote. Part of the impulse behind the contemporary historical novel and fictions in Assam may also lie in such a vision of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rakhi Kalita Moral ji. Now may I request Professor Rajan Sahitya ji. Rajan Sahitya ji is former professor of Nagaon Girls College, historian of repute from Northeast India. He was president of modern section of Indian History Congress and presently working as editor of Government of Assam project on political history of Assam after independence. Professor Rajan Sahitya ji.
Thank you, Mr. Devilji. I thank Sahitya Akademi for having asked me to participate in this seminar. I was asked that there will be 6 presentations in all. 3 persons will speak in English. 3 will speak in Assamese. I have been asked to speak in Assamese, so I will now.
Sir, you can speak in English as well. Sir, if you want to speak, you can speak in English because there are some other persons.
So it's up to you, sir. Your choice, sir.
Because I have taken down the notes in Assamese, so I'll be more
Okay, no
comfortable.
problem, sir. No problem. As you find easy, sir.
নমস্কাৰ আসলতে আপোনালোকে ইমান সময় হিষ্ট্ৰী আৰু লিটাৰেচাৰ সাহিত্য আৰু ইতিহাসৰ সম্পৰ্কৰ চাৰিটা বিশেষ ভাষণ শুনিলে ধ্ৰুৱজ্যোতি বৰাই উন্মোচন কৰিছিলে তাৰ পিছত নন্দনা দত্তৰ ৰজিউদ্দিন উকিল ৰাখী মৰলে ক'লে মই দুআষাৰমান কথা কম কিন্তু প্ৰথমতে এটা কথা ক'ব খুজিছো যে মই আসলতে এই কন্টেম্পৰেৰী হিষ্ট্ৰী যেটো ধাৰণা আৰু বিশেষকৈ শেহতীয়াকৈ ইতিহাসত যে খুব অধিক তত্ত্ব বা থিওৰিৰ যেটো প্ৰভাৱ পৰিছে মই হেতুৰ খুব মানে ভাল শুভফল হ'ব বুলি মই ভবা নাই সেইকাৰণে মোৰ অলপ ৰিজাৰ্ভেশন আছে নে টু মাচ থিওৰিজ but no facts এই ধৰণৰ ইতিহাসে আমাক আসলতে ইতিহাসক ইতিহাস কৰি ৰাখিবনে নাৰাখে মোৰ এই বিষয়ে সন্দেহ আছে আনকি আমি যাক কন্টেম্পৰেৰী হিষ্ট্ৰী বুলি কৈছো যে সমসাময়িক ইতিহাস দেখা গৈছে যে সেই বিষয়ত আমি যথেষ্ট সজাগ হ'ব লাগে কাৰণ আমি সমসাময়িক বুলি ক'লে আমি বহুত কথাই ক'ব পাৰো কিন্তু তাৰ মাজতে আমাৰ যেটো মূল ধৰ্ম যে ইতিহাস কাক বোলে আমি এটোই ইতিহাস যেন ইতিহাস হ'ল সমাজবদ্ধ মানুহৰ ইতিহাস সমাজবদ্ধ মানুহৰ কথাবিলাকে আমি ইতিহাসলৈ আনো ব্যক্তি মানুহৰ অস্তিত্ব থাকে সমাজত ব্যক্তি মানুহ থাকে তেওঁৰ অস্তিত্বও থাকে কিন্তু তেওঁৰ ইতিহাস নাথাকে ঐতিহাসিকজনে সমষ্টিবদ্ধ মানুহৰ ইতিহাসটো অধ্যয়ন কৰে ব্যক্তি মানুহৰ ইতিহাসটো তেওঁ অধ্যয়ন কৰিব নোৱাৰে আৰু তেওঁ হেতু স্কোপ নাই কি সাহিত্যিকে পাৰে লিটাৰেচাৰে এজন মানুহৰ ইতিহাস অধ্যয়ন কৰিব পাৰে তেওঁৰ অন্তৰ্জগতত প্ৰৱেশ কৰাৰ অধিকাৰ আছে কিন্তু হিষ্ট্ৰী হেতু কৰিব লগা নাই ঐতিহাসিকৰ কামটো মোটামুটি সাংবাদিকৰ তাৰ কামৰ নিচিনা সাংবাদিক এজনে যেনেকৈ এটা ঘটনা চাই তাক ৰিপৰ্ট কৰে কিন্তু সেই সংবাদৰ চৰিত্ৰবিলাকৰ ভিতৰলৈ তেওঁ নোসোমায় তেওঁ সোমোৱাৰ অধিকাৰ নাই আমি ঐতিহাসিক সকলো তেনেকৈ ঘটনা এটা কেনেকৈ ঘটিছিল সেই ঘটনাটো কিয় ঘটিছিল কোনে কোনে ঘটাইছিল কিয় ঘটিবলৈ পালে এই কথাবিলাকৰ ওপৰত বেছি গুৰুত্ব দিওঁ অৰ্থাৎ আমাৰ ইতিহাসৰ গোটেই বস্তু হ'ল যে এটা অতীত আশ্ৰয়ী সমাজবদ্ধ মানুহৰ এটা তথ্যনিষ্ঠ ব্যাখ্যা তথ্য থাকিব লাগে তথ্যপূৰ্ণ হ'ব লাগিব অবজেক্টিভ হ'ব লাগিব তথ্য যদি নাথাকে তেতিয়ালে ইতিহাস কি নাম পদবাচ্য হ'ব নোৱাৰে তাক আমি ইতিহাস বুলি ক'ব নোৱাৰো যেনেকৈ মই আগতে ক'লো যে একক মানুহৰ জীৱন আছে অস্তিত্ব আছে কিন্তু তাৰ ইতিহাস নাই সেই একক মানুহজনৰ অনুসন্ধান ইতিহাসে কৰিব নোৱাৰে কিন্তু সেই সাহিত্যই সেই একক মানুহজনক অধ্যয়ন কৰে আৰু তাক উপস্থাপন কৰিব পাৰে আচ্ছা আৰু এটা কথা হ'ল যে ঘটনা কৰা মানুহৰ মাজত আমি মননটো নোসোমাও এই কথাটো মই কৈছো কিন্তু তাৰ মাজত এতিয়া মন কৰিব যে হিষ্ট্ৰী অফ মেন্টালিটি এটো আসলতে ফৰাচী ঐতিহাসিক বিলাকৰ পৰা এটো বাহিৰলৈ এতিয়া সকলো দেশতে চাইছে যে মানুহৰ মানসিকতাৰ ইতিহাস অধ্যয়ন কৰে এই যে কিন্তু সেই মানসিকতাটো ব্যক্তি মানসিকতা নহয় কিন্তু সামগ্ৰিক মানসিকতা এটা কালেক্টিভ মাইন্ডটোহে ষ্টাডি কৰে সেই কাৰণে আমাৰ ট্ৰেডিশনাল হিষ্ট্ৰীৰ যেটো এটা ডাঙৰ মানে অৱলম্বন আছিল কালেক্টিভিটি যেটো পোষ্ট মডাৰ্নিষ্ট সকলে গ্ৰহণ নকৰে তৎসত্ত্বেও কিন্তু এটা দেখা গৈছে যে যদি মেন্টালিটি ষ্টাডি কৰিব লাগে বা অধ্যয়ন কৰিব লাগে তেতিয়াহলে তেওঁলোকে সেই কালেক্টিভিটি বা কালেক্টিভ মাইন্ডটো তেওঁলোকে ষ্টাডি কৰিব লাগিব সাহিত্যৰ এটা প্ৰধান উদ্দেশ্য হ'ল মানুহক আনন্দ দিব পাৰিব লাগিব কিন্তু ঐতিহাসিকৰ সেই আনন্দ দিয়াৰ দায়টো ঐতিহাসিকৰ নাই আপনি এখন উপন্যাস পঢ়ি এটা কাহিনী পঢ়ি আপনি জানে যে শৰৎচন্দ্ৰ উপন্যাস পঢ়িলে আপোনাৰ চকু পানী ওলাব আপনি কান্দিব লাগিব কিন্তু তথাপি আপনি পঢ়ে কাৰণ কন্দাটো আপোনাৰ আনন্দ কিন্তু ঐতিহাসিক এজনে কাকো এই কথাটো নিদিয়ে যে মোৰ কিতাপখন পঢ়ি মোৰ ইতিহাস পঢ়ি আপোনাক আনন্দ পাব এই কথাটো ঐতিহাসিকে কেতিয়াও তেনেকুৱা প্ৰতিশ্ৰুতি দিব নোৱাৰে আৰু তেওঁ দিয়া কৰ্তব্য নহয় তাৰ পিছত কথা হ'ল যে সুখ দুখ অধ্যয়ন কৰিব পাৰে ঐতিহাসিকে সুখ দুখ অধ্যয়ন কৰিব পাৰে মানুহ কি অৱস্থাত আছিল কেনেকৈ আছিল মানুহৰ অৰ্থনৈতিক জীৱনটো কেনেকুৱা আছিল সামাজিক জীৱন কেনেকুৱা আছিল সেই কথাটো অধ্যয়ন কৰিব পাৰে কিন্তু হেতু অধ্যয়ন কৰে ব্যক্তিগত জীৱনৰ পৰা নহয় সামাজিক জীৱনটো আমি যেনেকৈ ইৰফান হাবিবৰ কিতাপত দেখো যে মোগল যুগত কৃষকসকলৰ অৱস্থা কি দুৰৱস্থা আছিল কিন্তু আমি কোনো নিৰ্দিষ্ট এজন কৃষকৰ দুৰ্গতিৰ কথাটো তেওঁ দুৰৱস্থাৰ কথাটো অধ্যয়ন কৰা নাই আমি শ্ৰেণী হিচাপে চাইছো যে কৃষকবিলাকৰ অৱস্থাটো বেয়া আছিল আৰু সেইটো আমাৰ অধ্যয়নৰ হল বিষয় সেইকাৰণে সাহিত্যই যেনেকৈ এটা বস্তুৰ বা ব্যক্তি মানুহৰ বা সামাজিক মানুহৰ যেনেকৈ এটা আভ্যন্তৰীণ সত্যটো বিচাৰে ইতিহাসে সেই আভ্যন্তৰীণ সত্যটো অনুসন্ধান নকৰে বা কৰিবলৈ বাধ্য নহয় এই কথাটো হল মানে মোৰ ক'বলগীয়া কথা আৰু যি ঘটিছিল সেইটোহে ইতিহাস হ'ব পাৰে যি ঘটা নাই সেইটো ইতিহাস হ'ব নোৱাৰে কিন্তু যি ঘটা নাই সেইটো সাহিত্য হ'ব পাৰে সাহিত্যিকজনে মনতে ভাবি ল'লে যে এনেকুৱা এটা ঘটনা ঘটিছিল বা ঘটিছিল বুলি মই প্ৰেজেন্ট কৰো তেতিয়ালে সেইটো সাহিত্য হ'ব পাৰে কিন্তু ঐতিহাসিক এজনে এনেকুৱা ঘটনা ঘটিছিল বুলি ভাবি পেলাই তেওঁ ইতিহাস ৰচনা কৰিব নোৱাৰে ঘটনাটো ঘটিব লাগিব লিওপল্ড ফন ৰাংকা যাক আমি ফাদাৰ অফ মডাৰ্ণ হিষ্ট্ৰী বুলি কওঁ তেওঁ সেই কথাটোকে কৈছিলে যে ইতিহাস কি ঐতিহাসিকৰ কৰ্তব্য হ'ল সেই বস্তুটোক উদ্ধাৰ কৰা সেই অতীতটোক উদ্ধাৰ কৰা কোনটো অতীত এজ ইট ৰিয়েলি হেপেন যেনেকৈ ঘটনাটো ঘটিছিল সেইটোক উদ্ধাৰ কৰাটোৱেই ইতিহাস সেইটোৱে হ'ল ঐতিহাসিকৰ কৰ্তব্য কিন্তু কথাটো ক'বলৈ যিমান সহজ কৰিবলৈ সিমান সহজ নহয় এজ ইট ৰিয়েলি হেপেন এই কথাটোৱে যথেষ্ট বহুত স্কোপ আছে তাৰ যে কেনেকৈ ঘটনাটো ঘটিছিল নানা ৰকমৰ আমি প্ৰশ্ন কৰিব লগা হয় সেই প্ৰশ্ন কৰি পেলাইহে আমি তাৰ শুদ্ধ উত্তৰ পাব পাৰো আৰু অন্য এটা কথাটো হৈছে কি যে সাহিত্যিকে তাৰ লেখাৰ বিশেষ কৌশলত এটা কলাসন্মতভাৱে কল্পনাৰ ৰহন খানি পেলাই মানুহক গ্ৰহণযোগ্যভাৱে সাহিত্যৰ কৃতিটো প্ৰতিষ্ঠা কৰে অলপ আগতে ডক্টৰ ধ্ৰুৱজ্যোতি বৰা আজাৰ উপন্যাসখনৰ কথা কৈছে আপুনি আজাৰ উপন্যাসখন পঢ়িলে তাৰ এটা বিৱৰণ পাই থাকিব যে কেনেকৈ আজাৰ ঘৰ চালি থকা মানুহ ইগৰ মানে তাৰ মাজত আজাৰটো কেনেকৈ আহিল বেমাৰ আজাৰ সেই শব্দটো কালাজ্বৰটো আহিলে কালাজ্বৰ এই কালাজ্বৰ নগাঁও বিশেষকৈ একেবাৰে মানে গোটেই নদী মানে কলিয়াবৰৰ পৰা নগাঁও ওচৰলৈকে ব্ৰহ্মপুৰৰ ওচৰলৈকে একদম উচ্চন কৰি পেলাইছিল আচ্ছা সেই যিটো বৰ্ণনা সেই বৰ্ণনাটোতো কিন্তু আমি সম্পূৰ্ণ ইতিহাস বুলি ধৰিব নোৱাৰো কিন্তু আজি যদি কোনোবা ঐতিহাসিকে হিষ্ট্ৰী অফ এপিডেমিক্স লিখে আমি তাৰ পৰা কিছু উপাদান ল'ব পাৰো তাৰ সেইটো সীমাবদ্ধতা অথনি ৱাৰ এণ্ড পিছৰ কথা কৈছে ডক্টৰ বৰাই ঠিকে আছে ৱাৰ এণ্ড পিছ লিও টলষ্টয় 1869 প্ৰকাশ হোৱা এখন উপন্যাস সেই উপন্যাসখন লিখাৰ আগতে টলষ্টয়ে ভালকৈ পঢ়িছিল যে নেপোলিয়নৰ যিটো ৰাছিয়ান এগ্ৰেছন ৰাছিয়ান ইনভেশনটো ভালকৈ অধ্যয়ন কৰি লৈছিলে কিন্তু সিমান অধ্যয়ন কৰাৰ পিছতো লিও টলষ্টয়ৰ নিচিনা এজন খুব আটাইতকৈ প্ৰতিভাশালী সৃষ্টিশীল সাহিত্যিকে যিখন ৱাৰ এণ্ড পিছ লিখিলে তাৰ পৰা কিন্তু আপুনি ফ্ৰান্সৰ কি কয় নেপোলিয়নৰ যিটো অভিযান সেই অভিযানটো শুদ্ধ ছবি এখন নেদেখে কাৰণ লিও টলষ্টয়ে নেপোলিয়নৰ যিখন ছবি আঁকিছে সেইজন আসল নেপোলিয়ন নহয় দ্বিতীয়তে ৰাছিয়াৰ যিজন জেনেৰেল কুটজভ সেই কুটজভৰ যিখন ছবি লিও টলষ্টয়ে কুটজভৰ যিখন ছবি আঁকিছে সেইখন কিন্তু আসল কুটজভজন নহয় লিও টলষ্টয়ে এই কথাটো জানিছিল কিন্তু তেওঁ উপন্যাসৰ স্বাৰ্থত সেই কুটজভৰ চৰিত্ৰটোক এটা বেলেগ চৰিত্ৰৰ ৰূপ দিলে আপুনি ইতিহাসৰ কুটজভক যদি চাই তেতিয়াহ'লে ৱাৰ এণ্ড পিছৰ কুটজভ আপুনি দেখিব যে সেই একেজন কুটজভ নহয় ইতিহাসৰ নেপোলিয়নক যদি চাই তেতিয়াহ'লে দেখিব যে লিও টলষ্টয়ৰ যিজন নেপোলিয়ন সেইজন আসল নেপোলিয়ন নহয় গতিকে এইটো হ'ল ক্ৰিয়েটিভ লিটাৰেচাৰ সৃষ্টিশীল সাহিত্যৰ এইটো বাধা আপুনি কোনখিনিলৈকে ল'ব কোনখিনিলৈকে নল'ব কিন্তু মই ভাবো যে লিও টলষ্টয়ৰ সেই কিতাপখনৰ আটাইতকৈ মানে ডাঙৰ গুণ হ'ল যে ৰাছিয়াৰ সাধাৰণ জীৱনটো যিটো ৰাছিয়াৰ জনজীৱনক খুব সুন্দৰকৈ প্ৰতিষ্ঠা কৰিছিল টলষ্টয় আৰু এটা জাতিৰ মনস্তত্ব যে এটা জাতিক যে যুদ্ধৰ কাৰণে প্ৰস্তুত হৈ যায় গোটেই জাতিটো কিহে প্ৰেৰণা দি এই কথাটো লিও টলষ্টয়ে বিচাৰিছিল এইটো এটা দাৰ্শনিক প্ৰশ্ন যে হোৱাট মুভছ দ্য নেশ্যনছ আৰু সেই প্ৰশ্নটো উত্তৰ দিবলৈ নিজৰ ধৰণে চেষ্টা কৰিছে কৈছে সত্যানুসন্ধান কৰোঁতে এতিয়া ধৰক পোষ্ট মডাৰ্নিষ্টসকলে কৈছে আমাৰ এজন বক্তাই কৈছে যে পোষ্ট মডাৰ্নিষ্টসকলে কৈছে সত্য বোলা বস্তুটো ইলুচিভ সত্য বুলি আমি বস্তু এটা নাপাওঁ এইটো হ'ল এটা কনষ্ট্ৰাক্টেড টেক্সট constructed truth, constructed meaning. কিন্তু তৎসত্ত্বেও ইয়াৰ মাজত এটা বস্তু আছে, কিন্তু সত্যৰ গুৰুত্বটো পৰোক্ষভাৱে তাত স্বীকাৰ কৰা হৈছে। তাৰমানে পোষ্ট মডাৰ্নিষ্ট সকলেও সত্যটো বিচাৰে, কিন্তু সত্যটো তেওঁলোকে পাব পৰা বস্তু বুলি নাভাবে। তেওঁলোকে ভাবে যে এইটো এটা কনষ্ট্ৰাক্টেড ট্ৰুথ, যিটো সত্য ঘটি গ'ল সেইটোক আমি সেই ৰূপত হয়তো নেপাওঁ। এইটো খুব এটা ফাইনাৰ পইণ্টছ, কিন্তু মই ভাবো যে পোষ্ট মডাৰ্নিষ্ট সকলৰ এই কথাটো তেওঁলোকে সত্যৰ পৰা আঁতৰি যোৱা নাই। কিন্তু তেওঁলোকে বিচাৰে যে সত্য প্ৰতিষ্ঠা হ'ব লাগে, কিন্তু কেনেকৈ প্ৰতিষ্ঠা হ'ব লাগে সেইটো কাৰণে তেওঁলোকে কয় যে এইটো কনষ্ট্ৰাক্টেড ট্ৰুথ, গতিকে আমি সত্য মানে বিচাৰিব লাগিব। তেওঁলোকে এই তাৰ দ্বাৰা এইটো কথা কোৱা নাই যে আমি সত্য বিচাৰিব নালাগে। তাৰ পিছৰ এটা কথা আহিল যে এটা ঐতিহাসিকক এটা প্ৰশিক্ষণ লাগে। যি হিষ্টৰিয়ান হ'ব খোজে তেওঁক এটা ঐতিহাসিকৰ এজন প্ৰশিক্ষণ লাগিব, ট্ৰেইনিং লাগিব। সাহিত্যিক হ'বলৈ বোধহয় ট্ৰেইনিং নহ'লেও হয়। যেনে ধৰক লোকসাহিত্যৰ কথা মই কৈছো, অনাখৰি মানুহ লোকসাহিত্য ৰচনা কৰিছিল, বিহুগীত ৰচনা কৰিছিল, বনগীত ৰচনা কৰিছিল, আমুকৰ বৰগীত এইবোৰ ৰচনা কৰিছিল। তেওঁলোকে নিজে লিখিব পৰা নাছিল। গতিকে লোকসাহিত্য যিসকলে যদি লোকসাহিত্যক আমি সাহিত্য পদবাচ্য বস্তু বুলি কওঁ, সাহিত্য বুলি কওঁ, তেতিয়াহ'লে আমি ক'ব লাগিব যে সাহিত্য কৰিবৰ কাৰণে, সাহিত্য ৰচনা কৰিবৰ কাৰণে প্ৰশিক্ষণৰ প্ৰয়োজন নাই। প্ৰশিক্ষণ নোহোৱাকৈ সাহিত্যিক হ'ব পাৰে, নিজৰ যত্নটো সাহিত্যিক হ'ব পাৰে। ঠিক সেইদৰে ঐতিহাসিকো হ'ব পাৰে, কিন্তু এই যুগত আৰু এতিয়া নোৱাৰে। কৈছে এই যুগত এতিয়া আমেৰিকাত এনেকুৱা স্কুল আছে যে আপুনি কেনেকৈ গল্প লিখিব লাগে, কেনেকৈ উপন্যাস লিখিব লাগে আপোনাক ট্ৰেইনিং দিয়ে, সেইটো আছে এতিয়া। কিন্তু সামগ্ৰিকভাৱে মই কৈছো পৃথিৱীত তেনেকুৱা কোনো স্কুল ট্ৰেইনিং নাই এতিয়া। ধৰক কিন্তু বুৰঞ্জীৰ ক্ষেত্ৰত এটা প্ৰশিক্ষণ লাগিব, এটা উমেদাৰী সময় লাগিব। ইতিহাস কেনেকৈ ৰচনা কৰে তাৰ বিষয়ে এটা ট্ৰেইনিং লাগিব, আৰু তাৰ কাৰণে আনুষ্ঠানিক ট্ৰেইনিং আমি স্কুল, কলেজ, বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ত গৱেষণা কৰোঁতে শিকো, অধ্যয়নৰ মাজেদি শিকো, তাৰ কাৰণে মেথডলজিৰ কিতাপ আছে ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি। সেইকাৰণে ঐতিহাসিকৰ কাম আৰু সাহিত্যিকৰ কাম একেটা নহয়, একে ধৰণৰ নহয়। আমি সাহিত্যৰ কাম আমি ঐতিহাসিকসকলে ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিব পাৰো, কিন্তু দুই ক্ষেত্ৰত এটা লিমিটেশ্যন আছে। আৰু ইতিহাসৰ পৰা মানুহে কি বস্তু বিচাৰে? এটা বিশ্বাসযোগ্যতা বিচাৰে। এই কথাটো সদায় মনত ৰাখিব, ঐতিহাসিকসকলে সদায় মনত ৰাখিব লাগিব যে ঐতিহাসিকৰ মৰ্যাদা হ'ল তেওঁ বিশ্বাসযোগ্যতাৰ ওপৰত। ঐতিহাসিকজনে যি কথা লিখিছে সেই কথা সঁচা বা সঁচা বুলি মানুহে বিশ্বাস কৰিব লাগিব, এইটো হ'ল ঐতিহাসিকজনৰ কৃতিত্ব। কিন্তু সাহিত্যিকজনে লিখে, যদি ঐতিহাসিক উপন্যাস এখন লিখে, মানুহে কিন্তু তাৰ পৰা সেই ঐতিহাসিক সত্যটো নিবিচাৰে। ৰজনীকান্ত বৰদলৈ উপন্যাসত মানুহে এই কথাবোৰ আখৰ আখৰ ইতিহাস বুলি নিবিচাৰে, যে ইতিহাস সেইটো সমল হিচাপে ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছে, কিন্তু সেইটো একেবাৰে শতকৰা 100% শুদ্ধ নহয়। বেজবৰুৱাৰ জয়মতীয়ে হওক বা গোহাঁই বুঢ়াৰ জয়মতীয়ে হওক, এইবোৰ একেবাৰে ইতিহাসৰ সমল হিচাপে ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছো। সেইখন আমি জয়মতী বুলি কিন্তু ঐতিহাসিকে কেতিয়াও গ্ৰহণ নকৰে। গতিকে সাহিত্যৰ কথাটোত সাহিত্যিকজনৰ এটা লিবাৰ্টি থাকে। তেওঁ ষ্টৰিটো যদি ভালকৈ প্ৰেজেণ্ট কৰে, সেই কাল্পনিকো যদি হয়, ষ্টৰিটো যদি মানুহে গ্ৰহণ কৰে, তেওঁ সফল হ'ব পাৰে। মই আমাৰ বহুত মানুহে পঢ়া এখন বিখ্যাত উপন্যাসৰ কথা কওঁ, অসমীয়ালৈ অনুবাদ হৈছে বিভূতিভূষণ বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়ৰ ইছামতী। ইছামতী নদীক লৈ আপোনালোকে জানে, খুব বিখ্যাত উপন্যাস। আচ্ছা, ইছামতী নদীত মানে তাৰ যিটো নৈসৰ্গ, তাৰ যিটো প্ৰকৃতিৰ বৰ্ণনা, অপূৰ্ব বৰ্ণনা, কিন্তু তাৰ হিষ্ট্ৰীবোৰ মানে ইমান গোলমলীয়া। যেনে ধৰক তাত মানে তাত নীল বিদ্ৰোহৰ কথা কৈছে। নীল বিদ্ৰোহ 1859ত আৰম্ভ হ'ল, 1861ত নীল বিদ্ৰোহ শেষ। কিন্তু ইছামতী উপন্যাসত পাব যে নীল বিদ্ৰোহ 1863 আৰম্ভ হৈছে। ঠিক তেনেকৈ ভাইচ ৰয় লৰ্ড মেয়ক হেৰিয়াত মাৰিলে, কি কয়, আন্দামান নিকোবৰ আইলেণ্ডছত যে হত্যা কৰিলে, সেই ঘটনাটো 10 বছৰ 15 বছৰ গোলমাল কৰি পেলাইছে। লগে লগে ইতিহাসৰ মানুহে তেতিয়া সমালোচনা কৰিলে যে এইখনতো হিষ্ট্ৰীবোৰ গোলমাল হৈছে গোটেইবোৰ। তেতিয়া বিভূতিভূষণ বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়ে একো উত্তৰ নিদিলে, কিন্তু মানুহে তাক গ্ৰহণ কৰিছে, সাহিত্য কৰ্ম বুলি গ্ৰহণ কৰিছে, ইতিহাস বুলি গ্ৰহণ কৰা নাই। সাহিত্য কৰ্ম হিচাপে সফল, আৰু সেইটো হ'ল তাৰ কৃতিত্ব। কিন্তু এজন ঐতিহাসিকে 1861 চনৰ ইণ্ডিগো ৰিভল্টটো বা নীল বিদ্ৰোহটো 1863 বুলি ক'লে মানুহে গ্ৰহণ নকৰে। সেইকাৰণে ঐতিহাসিকৰ বিশ্বাসযোগ্যতাটো হ'ল তেওঁ সত্যৰ ওপৰত প্ৰতিষ্ঠা হ'ব লাগিব। তেওঁ যিখিনি বস্তু পায় সেইটো গৱেষণা ভিত্তিক হ'ব লাগিব, সত্যৰ ওপৰত প্ৰতিষ্ঠা হ'ব লাগিব। আৰু যদি সি সত্যৰ ওপৰত প্ৰতিষ্ঠা নহয়, ইতিহাস হ'ব নোৱাৰে। আৰু এতিয়া ইতিহাস বুলি কওঁতে ধৰক তাৰ এতিয়া বহুত ইতিহাসৰ শাখা বুলি অকল পলিটিকেল হিষ্ট্ৰী নহয়। এতিয়া আপোনাৰ ধৰক এতিয়া আমেৰিকাৰ প্ৰভাৱ খুব এতিয়া পৰ্যায়বৰ্ণ ইতিহাস জনপ্ৰিয় হৈ আছে। আমি ক'ব নোৱাৰো এই শতিকাৰ শেষলৈ কি হয়, কিন্তু এই শতিকাত আমি দেখিছো একবিংশ শতিকাত আমি দেখিছো যে পৰ্যায়বৰ্ণ ইতিহাস খুব জনপ্ৰিয় হৈছে। আচ্ছা, কিন্তু এই শতিকাৰ শেষলৈ হয়তো বেলেগ কথাই হ'ব, কাৰণ প্ৰত্যেকটো জেনেৰেশ্যনে তাৰ প্ৰত্যেকটো প্ৰজন্মই তেওঁলোকে বিচাৰে যে আমি এই সময় এই ইতিহাসটো জানো। যেনে আমাৰ দেশত যেতিয়া জাতীয় আন্দোলন হৈ আছিল তেতিয়া মানুহৰ প্ৰয়োজনটো বেলেগ আছিল। এতিয়া আমি আকৌ জাতীয় নিৰ্মাণৰ সময়ত আমাৰ প্ৰয়োজনটো বেলেগ হৈছে। কিন্তু সকলো ইতিহাসতে হয় এতিয়াও সাধাৰণভাৱে এই কথাটো ক'ব খুজিছো যে আপুনি পলিটিকেল হিষ্ট্ৰী লিখক, ইকনমিক হিষ্ট্ৰী লিখক, ছ'চিয়েল হিষ্ট্ৰী লিখক, এনভাইৰনমেন্টৰ হিষ্ট্ৰী লিখক, মিলিটাৰী হিষ্ট্ৰী লিখক, তাৰপিছত অন্যান্য হিষ্ট্ৰী লিখক, মহামাৰী ইতিহাস লিখক, ঐতিহাসিক কাৰ্য যদি হ'ব খোজে, সি যদি ইতিহাস পদবাচ্য হ'ব লাগে, সি গৱেষণা ভিত্তিক হ'ব লাগিব আৰু তথ্য নিৰ্ভৰ হ'ব লাগিব, বস্তুনিষ্ঠ হ'ব লাগিব, তেতিয়াহে সি ইতিহাস বুলি মানুহে গ্ৰহণ কৰিব। কিন্তু আৰু সেইকাৰণে সৃষ্টিশীল সাহিত্য কি বুলি কোৱা হয়? ফিকশ্যন বুলি কোৱা হয়, মিথ বুলি কোৱা হয়। ফিকশ্যন মানে কাল্পনিক কাহিনী। কাল্পনিক কাহিনী এতিয়া সাহিত্যত 100% হ'ব পাৰে, কাল্পনিক কাহিনী 100% সাহিত্য হ'ব পাৰে, কিন্তু কাল্পনিক কাহিনীৰ 1% হিষ্ট্ৰী হ'ব নোৱাৰে। আমি ইতিহাসৰ মানুহে এই কথাটো মনত ৰাখিব লাগিব। আৰু এটা কথা হৈছে ইতিহাসৰ সমল ব্যৱহাৰ। সেই ইতিহাসৰ সমল ব্যৱহাৰৰ এটা মানে ট্ৰেইনিং লাগে। সেই ট্ৰেইনিংটো কেৱল ইতিহাসৰ ছাত্ৰই সেই ট্ৰেইনিংটো কৰে, আন সকলে সেই ট্ৰেইনিংটো ল'ব নোৱাৰে। আৰু সেইকাৰণে যেতিয়া আমি তত্ত্বৰ কথা ব্যৱহাৰ কৰোঁ আৰু মানে হিষ্ট্ৰীত তত্ত্ব বা থিয়ৰী তেতিয়াহে ৰিলিভেণ্ট হয় বা প্ৰাসংগিক হয় যেতিয়া বিশিষ্ট ঘটনাৰ মাজেদি তাৰ সত্যটো প্ৰতিষ্ঠিত হয়। আমেৰিকান হিষ্ট্ৰীত থিয়ৰীৰ প্ৰকোপটো বেছি, তাৰ কাৰণটো কি? আমেৰিকা ইজ এ ভেৰি ইয়াং নেশ্যন। আমেৰিকাই জাতি হিচাপে আমেৰিকাই স্বাধীনতা ঘোষণা কৰিলে 1776-ত। জাতি হিচাপে ধৰক আৰম্ভ হ'ল 1781-ৰ পৰা। গতিকে ঐতিহাসিকভাৱে জাতিটো একেবাৰে ইয়াং নেশ্যন। গতিকে তেওঁলোকে আমাৰ ভাৰতবৰ্ষত যেনেকৈ পৌৰাণিক ট্ৰেডিশ্যনৰ কথা অকিলে ক'লে, ৰামায়ণ মহাভাৰতৰ কথা আছে, মধ্যযুগৰ সাহিত্যৰ কথা আছে, নেটিভ হিষ্ট্ৰী নেটিভ লেংগুৱেজত কি কয় ভাৰ্নিকুলাৰ সাহিত্যৰ কথা আছে, অসমত যেনেকৈ অসমীয়া বুৰঞ্জী সাহিত্যৰ কথা আছে, আমেৰিকাত সেই ট্ৰেডিশ্যনটো নাই। গতিকে তেওঁলোকৰ তাত থিয়ৰীৰ প্ৰকোপটো বেছি। আজি আমেৰিকান হিষ্ট্ৰী কিছুমান মই এতিয়া দেখিছো যে সেই থিয়ৰীবিলাক যদি আমি ভাৰতবৰ্ষত বা আমাৰ নিচিনা দেশত যদি আমি প্ৰয়োগ কৰিবলৈ যাওঁ, তেতিয়াহ'লে মানুহে সাহিত্য পঢ়িব কিন্তু ইতিহাস নপঢ়ে। গতিকে মই শব্দটো ভুল হ'ব পাৰে, মই কৈছো ইতিহাসৰ যদি পবিত্ৰতা বা পবিত্ৰতা বুলি নকলেও যদি ইতিহাসৰ সত্যতা বা ইতিহাসৰ মৰ্যাদা যদি ৰক্ষা কৰিব লাগে, তেতিয়াহ'লে মই ভাবো যে ইতিহাসৰ ছাত্ৰসকলে ইতিহাসৰ মৰ্যাদাটো ৰক্ষা কৰা আমাৰ এটা প্ৰাথমিক কৰ্তব্য আছে। আমাৰ ধৰক এতিয়া থিয়ৰীৰ কথাটো, এতিয়া এটা বিষয়ত আমাৰ থিয়ৰী হয় যে আমি মোৱামৰীয়া বিদ্ৰোহক আমি মাৰ্কসিষ্ট এংগুলৰ পৰাও চাব পাৰো, নন মাৰ্কসিষ্ট এংগুলৰ পৰাও চাব পাৰো। দুইটাই শুদ্ধ হ'ব পাৰে। মাৰ্ক্সবাদী দৃষ্টিভংগীৰে মাৰ্ক্সবাদী তত্ত্বৰ তেওঁ সেইটো দৃষ্টিৰ পৰা চাব লাগে, কোনোবাই তাৰ সম্পূৰ্ণ এটা 100 ডিগ্ৰী 180 ডিগ্ৰীৰ বিপৰীত দৃষ্টিভংগীৰ পৰা চাব পাৰে, সেইটো চোৱাৰ অধিকাৰ আছে। কিন্তু কোনটো শুদ্ধ কোনটো ভুল কেনেকৈ নিৰ্ণয় কৰিব? মই ভাবো যে কোনটো গ্ৰহণ কৰিলে মানুহে কোনটো নকৰিলে এই ধৰণৰ বিচাৰ কেৱল মহাকালে কৰিব পাৰে। অনলি টাইম, সময় নিৰ্ধাৰণ কৰিব কোনটো মানুহে গ্ৰহণ কৰিলে কোনটো মানুহে গ্ৰহণ নকৰিলে। আজি আপুনি তৰ্ক কৰি লাভ নাই। আপুনি আপোনাৰটো সত্য বুলি কৈছে, মই মোৰটো সত্য বুলি কৈছো, কিন্তু কোনটো সত্য সেইটো নিৰ্ভৰ কৰিব লাগিব মহাকালে। ঐতিহাসিকে এটা কাম কৰে, আমি থিয়ৰী নাথাকে, কিন্তু আপোনালোকে জানে যিসকলে গৱেষণা কৰে তেওঁলোকে মনত এটা হাইপথিচিছ, এটা ভাৱ কল্প সৃষ্টি কৰি লয়। এইটো ঘটনা এনেকে ঘটিছিল নে, ঘটিব পাৰিলেহেঁতেন নে, বা ঘটিছিল, সেই হাইপথিচিছটো আপুনি ফলো কৰে। আৰু যিসকলে এটা নিৰ্দিষ্ট থিয়ৰী যদি চাই তেওঁলোকৰ মনত এটা আদৰ্শৰ প্ৰতিষ্ঠা কৰি লয়। আগতে তেওঁলোকে এটা কথা ভাবি লয় যে মই এনেকৈ লিখিম, তেনেকৈ লিখিলে তেওঁৰ যিটো আদৰ্শ, তেওঁৰ যিটো থিয়ৰী সেইটো হয়তো প্ৰতিপন্ন কৰিব পাৰে, কিন্তু সি ইতিহাস হ'বনে নহয়, পাঠকে গ্ৰহণ কৰিব নে নকৰে, তাৰ আদালতটো হ'ব পাঠক শ্ৰেণী তাক লৈ তৰ্ক কৰাৰ কোনো প্ৰয়োজন নাই সেই কথাটো মই ক'ব খুজিছো মই বৰ বিদ্ৰোহৰ কথা কৈছো আৰু এতিয়া অসমীয়াত ধৰি লওক মানে ইতিহাসৰ চৰ্চা বহুত দিনৰ পৰাই হৈছে অসমীয়া বুৰঞ্জী সাহিত্য এটা ডাঙৰ সম্পদ সেই বিষয়ে বহুত আলোচনা হৈছে আজি এই আলোচনাত আৰু মই সেই বিষয়ে আলোচনা নকওঁ কিন্তু দুটামান কথা মানে ক'ব লাগিব আমি সদায় ইতিহাসৰ ছাত্ৰ ছাত্ৰীসকলে মনত ৰাখো যে সাহিত্য আৰু ইতিহাসৰ আটাইতকৈ উত্তম মিলন ক্ষেত্ৰ হৈছে জীৱনী সাহিত্য হিষ্ট্ৰী আৰু লিটাৰেচাৰ আটাইতকৈ বেষ্ট মিটিং পইণ্টছটো হ'ল বায়োগ্ৰাফি জীৱনী সাহিত্য সেইকাৰণে আপুনি মন কৰিব যিসকল সফল ঐতিহাসিক সেইসকল কিন্তু একে সময়তে সফল জীৱনী সাহিত্যকাৰ মই অথনি ৰাংকেৰ কথা কৈছিলো জাৰ্মান যাৰ ফাদাৰ অফ মডাৰ্ণ হিষ্ট্ৰী বুলি কৈছো সেই ৰাংকাৰ লিওপল্ড ফন ৰাংকাৰ তেওঁকোতো জীৱন তেওঁ বহুত দীৰ্ঘ জীৱন পাইছিলে 91 ইয়াৰ্ছ বাচি আছিলে আৰু তেওঁৰ জীৱনৰ শেষ দিনলৈকে তেওঁ হিষ্ট্ৰী লিখিছিল আৰু তেওঁ 5টা ভাষা জানিছিল ইউৰোপৰ সব ভাষা জানিছিল গতিকে তেওঁৰ সুবিধা বহুত বেছি বহুত প্ৰতিভাৱান মানুহ আছিলে জাৰ্মান জানিছিলে ইংলিছ জানিছিলে ফ্ৰেঞ্চ জানিছিলে স্পেনিছ জানিছিল ইটালিয়ান জানিছিল এই 5টা ভাষা জানিছিল গতিকে তেওঁৰ বহুত সুবিধা আছিল আৰু তেওঁৰ জীৱন ইমান ভলিউমছ এতিয়া তাৰ ভিতৰত অন্য কথা তেওঁ কালেক্টেড ভলিউমছ হ'ল 45 এভাৰেজ 500 পেজৰ কালেক্টেড ৱৰ্কছ হ'ল 45 নাম্বাৰছ সেই ৰাংকে কিন্তু বিখ্যাত হৈছিলে হিষ্ট্ৰী অফ দ্য পোপছ লিখি পোপ সকলৰ বুৰঞ্জী এইবোৰ সব বায়োগ্ৰাফিকেল স্কেচেছ 3টা ভলিউমত লিখিছিল গতিকে আমি যাক ফাদাৰ অফ হিষ্ট্ৰী বুলি কৈছো তেওঁ জীৱনী সাহিত্যত তাৰ আগতে তেওঁ আৰু এখন খুব ভাল বায়োগ্ৰাফি লিখিছিল মানে বায়োগ্ৰাফি অফ সাভানাৰোলা তেওঁ হ'ল ৰিলিজিয়াছ ক্লেৰিক আচ্ছা গতিকে তেওঁ সেইটো সুবিধা হৈছিল বহু ভাষা জানে তেওঁ যদি ইউৰোপৰ প্ৰধান 5টা ভাষা জানিছিল গতিকে তেওঁ বহুত কথা মানে এতিয়া আৰ্কাইভ বিলাকলৈ গৈ তেওঁ কাৰো সহায় নোলোৱাকে নিজ নিজ ভাষাৰ সেইবোৰ অধ্যয়ন কৰা সম্ভৱ হৈছিলে সেইটো এটা সদায় সুবিধা মানে হিষ্টৰিয়ান সকল যদি বহু ভাষাবিদ হয় তেওঁলোকে যদি বহু ভাষা জানে সেইটো বহুত সুবিধাৰ কাৰণ হয় মই এতিয়া মোৰ অন্ততৰ লগত ঘনিষ্ঠ মানুহবিলাকক মই সদায় কওঁ যে সদায় এটা ভাষা শিকিবা এটা বা দুটা ভাষা আমি শিকিবলৈ যিসকলে ইতিহাসৰ গৱেষণা কৰোঁ আমি জীৱনত সেই কামটো নকৰিলো গতিকে বৰ দুখ হয় আমাৰ খুব লিমিটেশনছ হৈ থাকিল আমি ইংৰাজী আৰু অসমীয়াৰ মাজতে থাকিল অন্য ভাষাত আৰু সোৰ্চৰ আমি বুজি নাপাওঁ আনকি অসমৰ এটা জনজাতি ভাষাও আমি নিশিকিলো আমাৰ সেইবোৰ লিমিটেশনছ থাকি গ'ল কিন্তু সাহিত্যসকলৰ এইটো বিষয়ত এটা সুবিধা আছে এজন সাহিত্যিকে যদি কেৱল এটা ভাষা জানে কেৱল এটা ভাষা জানিও যদি তেওঁ ভাল সাহিত্য সৃষ্টি কৰে তেওঁ পৃথিৱী বিখ্যাত হ'ব পাৰে তেওঁ সাহিত্য পৃথিৱীৰ সকলো ভাষালৈ অনুবাদ হোৱাৰ সম্ভাৱনা আছে এই কথাটো জানিব ঐতিহাসিকসকলে বেছি ভাষা জনা ভাল নাজানিলেও কথা নাই জানা ভাল আৰু মই বিশেষকৈ ডেকা মানুহবিলাকক ক'ব খোজো যে তেওঁলোকে যাতে শিকিবৰ যত্ন কৰে চন্দন শৰ্মা মোৰ লগত থাকোতে মই চন্দনক খুব জোৰ কৰিছিলো চন্দনৰ মনত আছে চাগৈ যে তুমি সংস্কৃত ভাষাটো শিকা মই চন্দন খুব কাৰণ সংস্কৃত ভাষাৰ গুৰুত্ব বাঢ়িব বুলি মই 1990 চন মানত খুব ভালকৈ বুজি পাইছিল আৰু এতিয়া দেখিছো যে গুৰুত্বটো বাঢ়িছে আৰু এতিয়া আমাৰ দেখা গৈছে যে আমাৰ সংস্কৃত সাহিত্য গৱেষণা আটাইতকৈ ভাল গৱেষণাবিলাক প্ৰথমে চেলডন পলকে কৰিছিল আৰু এতিয়া আমেৰিকাৰ বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়বিলাকৰ পৰা পঢ়ি আছে ব্যাখ্যাও আছে অপব্যাখ্যাও আছে যিয়ে নহওক কিন্তু আমি ইণ্ডিয়ান স্কলাৰবিলাকে তেওঁলোকৰ সন্মুখত সমানে থিয় হ'ব পৰা নাইকিয়া আচ্ছা মই বায়োগ্ৰাফিৰ কথা কৈছিলো জীৱনী সাহিত্য গতিকে ঐতিহাসিকসকলে এই সাহিত্য জীৱনী সাহিত্য আৰু লিটাৰেচাৰ এই দুইটা মিটিং পইণ্ট হৈছে হিষ্ট্ৰী অসমৰ ঐতিহাসিকসকললৈ যাওঁ সূৰ্য কুমাৰ ভূঞাই 120 বছৰ আগতে লিখিছিল জীৱনী সাহিত্য আনন্দৰাম বৰুৱা 1920 চনত লিখিছিল সেই সময়ত তেওঁ ছাত্ৰ জীৱন ঠিক পাৰ হৈছে মাত্ৰ কিন্তু ইমান কষ্ট কৰি যাক লগ পালে এটা বাক্য পায় এটা শব্দ পায় সেই মানুহবিলাকক কলিকতা লগ ধৰিছে অসমৰ লগ ধৰি পেলাই সেই বায়োগ্ৰাফি লিখিছিল আৰু এতিয়া অন্ততঃ জীৱনী সাহিত্যৰ সমালোচকসকলে কৈছে যিসকলে অসমীয়া জীৱনী সাহিত্য অধ্যয়ন কৰিছে সমালোচনা কৰিছে যে সূৰ্য কুমাৰ ভূঞা আনন্দৰাম বৰুৱাখনে হ'ল এতিয়ালৈকে শ্ৰেষ্ঠ অসমীয়া জীৱনী মই ভাবো যে সেই কথা লৈ অসমীয়া সকলো ইতিহাসৰ ছাত্ৰই গৌৰৱ কৰিব পাৰে এতিয়া অসমীয়া ভাষাৰ আটাইতকৈ শ্ৰেষ্ঠ জীৱনীখন কিন্তু সাহিত্যিকে ৰচনা কৰা নাই ঐতিহাসিকে ৰচনা কৰিছে অৱশ্যে একে সময়তে সূৰ্য কুমাৰ ভূঞা কবিও আছিল সাহিত্যিকো আছিল আৰু সেই ঐতিহাসিক চৰিত্ৰবিলাকক লৈতো জীৱনী লিখিছিলে লাচিত বৰফুকন লিখিছে ৰায়চৰ সিংহ লিখিছে আতন বৰগোহাঁই লিখিছে ইত্যাদিবোৰ লিখিছিল তাৰ উপৰিও আপোনালোকে হয়তো বহুতে জানে যে সূৰ্য কুমাৰ ভূঞাই বহুত মানে জীৱনী কিছুমান চিত্ৰ লিখিছে স্কেচেছ যিবিলাক কয় বহুত প্ৰায় 50-60 গৰাকীমান মানুহৰ খুব সুন্দৰ স্কেচ আছে সেইটো এটা বৰ ডাঙৰ কাম তাৰ পিছত বেনুধৰ শৰ্মাই মণিৰাম দেৱান লিখিছিলে পণ্ডিত হেমচন্দ্ৰ গোস্বামীৰ কথা লিখিছিল বিঞ্চি কুমাৰ হিষ্ট্ৰিয়ান একে সময়তে সাহিত্যিক অসমৰ কালচাৰেল হিষ্ট্ৰীৰ বাটকটীয়া একে সময়তে শ্ৰেষ্ঠ উপন্যাসৰ লেখক জীৱনৰ বাটত সেউজী পাতৰ কাহিনী অমলেন্দু গুহ হিষ্ট্ৰিয়ান একে সময়তে তেওঁ ভ্ৰমণ কাহিনী লিখিছে সুন্দৰ কবিতা লিখিছে গতিকে এইবোৰ আমাৰ ট্ৰেডিশ্যনত আছিলে সূৰ্য কুমাৰ ভূঞাৰ কথা মই কৈছো আৰু অসংখ্য আৰু বেনুধৰ শৰ্মাৰ মণিৰাম দেৱান একে সময়তে বেনুধৰ শৰ্মা ইন হিজ ওন ৰাইট হি ইজ এ লিটাৰী ফিগাৰ সাহিত্যিক মানুহ সাহিত্য কৰ্ম ৰচনা কৰিছে গতিকে এইবিলাক কথা আমি সদায় মনত ৰাখিব লাগিব যে বায়োগ্ৰাফি আৰু হিষ্ট্ৰী এটা বিশেষ সম্পৰ্ক আছে আৰু এজন ভাল ঐতিহাসিকে একোজন ভাল বায়োগ্ৰাফি লিখিব পাৰে আৰু এতিয়া মই ইয়াৰ কথা ক'লো অসমৰ কথা ক'লো এতিয়া ভাৰতৰ যদি উদাহৰণ দিওঁ সৰ্বপল্লী গোপাল JNU বিশ্ববিদ্যালয় আছিল সৰ্বপল্লী গোপাল আধুনিক ভাৰতবৰ্ষৰ এজন ডাঙৰ হিষ্ট্ৰিয়ান তেওঁ সুন্দৰ বায়োগ্ৰাফি অন্তত দুখনৰ কথা আপোনালোকে জানে এখন লিখিছে তেওঁ দেউতাক সৰ্বপল্লী ৰাধাকৃষ্ণনৰ বায়োগ্ৰাফি এটা খণ্ডত তাৰ পিছত লিখিলে জৱাহৰলাল নেহৰুৰ বায়োগ্ৰাফি 3টা খণ্ডত লিখিছে সুন্দৰ বায়োগ্ৰাফি লিখিছে গতিকে এইটো ঐতিহাসিকৰ কাৰণে এইটো সম্ভৱ এনেকুৱা বহুত উদাহৰণ দিব যে ঐতিহাসিকসকলে সুন্দৰ বায়োগ্ৰাফি লিখা উদাহৰণ দিব পাৰি আৰু তাৰপৰা পণ্ডিত জৱাহৰলাল নেহৰু এইবিলাকতো একেবাৰে বিশিষ্ট মানুহ যিসকল একে সময়তে ক্ৰিয়েটৰ অফ হিষ্ট্ৰী আৰু একে সময়তে ৰাইটাৰ অফ হিষ্ট্ৰী জৱাহৰলাল নেহৰুৱে এটা অৰ্থত ইতিহাস সৃষ্টি কৰিছিলে স্বাধীনতা আন্দোলনত থাকি পেলাই আৰু একে সময়তে নেহৰুৱে ইতিহাস লিখিছিল এই যে গ্লিমছেছ অফ ৱৰ্ল্ড হিষ্ট্ৰী এখন আসলে দুটা ভলিউমত প্ৰকাশ হৈছিল 1934ত এইবোৰ আচলতে জীয়েকলৈ লিখা চিঠি কিন্তু এই চিঠিবিলাক হ'ল আচলতে সভ্যতাৰ একেবাৰে মানুহৰ সভ্যতাৰ উষা কালৰ পৰা 1930 চনলৈকে ঘটা ঘটনাবিলাক লৈ 196খন চিঠি লিখিছিল সেইবিলাক হ'ল এই হিষ্ট্ৰী অফ এই গ্লিমছেছ অফ ৱৰ্ল্ড হিষ্ট্ৰী অসমীয়া ভাষালৈ অনুবাদ হৈছে আপোনালোকে দেখিছে যে নেহৰুৰ যি মেজিষ্ট্ৰিয়েল চাৰ্ভে ইতিহাসৰ যিটো পৰ্যবেক্ষণ তেওঁ বিজ্ঞানৰ ছাত্ৰ আছিল কিন্তু তাৰ ওপৰত তেওঁৰ যিটো প্ৰতিভা আৰু যিটো প্ৰতিভাৰে তেওঁ লিখিছে আৰু যেনেকৈ প্ৰকাশ যিটো ক্ষমতা সেইটো সঁচাকৈ তবত মানিবলগীয়া তাৰ পিছত যিখন ডিস্কভাৰী অফ ইণ্ডিয়া সেইখন সমানেই গুৰুত্বপূৰ্ণ কিতাপ 1944 চনত প্ৰকাশ হৈছিল কিন্তু এনেকুৱা প্ৰতিভা যিকোনো দেশতেই কম এনেকুৱা প্ৰতিভাটো ভাৰতবৰ্ষত কিমান হৈছে খুব কম আৰু তেনেকৈ ধৰক কেতিয়াবা একোটা ভাষণৰ সাংঘাতিক গুৰুত্বপূৰ্ণ অৱস্থান থাকে ঐতিহাসিক পৰম্পৰাত যেনেকৈ মই নেহৰুৰ কথা ক'লো নেহৰুৰ এই ভাষণটো যে ট্ৰাইজ টু ডেষ্টিনি যিটো ভাষণ স্বাধীনতাৰ সময়ত দিছিলে গোটেই ভাৰতবৰ্ষৰ বা গোটেই পৃথিৱী মানে শুনিছিলে সেইটো এটা বিখ্যাত ভাষণ সেই ভাষণৰ লগত যেনেকৈ আমি জানো ইতিহাসৰ ছাত্ৰসকলে যে পেৰিক্লিছে এথেন্সত 431 খ্ৰীষ্টাব্দত পেলোপনেছিয়ান যুদ্ধৰ প্ৰথম হৰাৰ পিছত পেলোপনেছিয়ানৰ এথেন্সৰ বীৰ সৈনিকসকল যুদ্ধত সমাধি ক্ষেত্ৰত পৰি আছে সেই সমাধি ক্ষেত্ৰত তেওঁ দিয়া যিটো ভাষণ অপূৰ্ব ভাষণ হাজাৰবাৰ আপোনালোকে পঢ়ি থাকিব পাৰে আৰু তাৰ নিচিনা সাহিত্য কৰ্মই নাই সাহিত্য কৰ্ম তাৰ লগত তুলনাত খুব কম ভাষণটো অৱশ্যে দীঘল এতিয়া মই আপোনালোকক আটাইতকৈ এটা চমু ভাষণৰ কথা কওঁ ভাষণটো আপোনালোকে মনত ৰাখিব হয়তো আপোনালোকৰ হয়তো বহুতে সৌভাগ্য হৈছে পঢ়া আব্ৰাহাম লিংকনৰ এটা বিখ্যাত ভাষণ সেইটো গেটিছবাৰ্গ লেংগুৱেজ বুলি কয় গেটিছবাৰ্গ লেকচাৰ বুলি কয় গেটিছবাৰ্গত তেনেকৈ যুদ্ধ হৈছিলে তাৰ চলজাৰ বিলাকৰ মৃতদেহ পৰি আছে তেওঁলোকক সমাধিস্থ কৰিব লাগিব আৰু সেইদিনাখন আচলতে তেওঁ সেই ভাষণটো দিবলৈ গৈছিলে তাৰ আগতে তেওঁ সেই ভাষণটো দিছিলে আমেৰিকাৰ আৰু এজন খুব সমান বিখ্যাত মানুহ এডৱাৰ্ড এভাৰেট বুলি এজন মানুহ তেওঁ খুব ইন্টেলেকচুৱেল পণ্ডিত মানুহ তেওঁ প্ৰথমটো ভাষণ দিলে সেই ভাষণেই আছিল মানে পৃথিৱীৰ বিখ্যাত হ'বলগীয়া ভাষণ কিন্তু তাৰ পিছত মাত্ৰ 3 মিনিটৰ ভাষণ দিছিলে আমেৰিকাৰ ৰাষ্ট্ৰপতি আব্ৰাহাম লিংকনে সেই 3 মিনিটৰ ভাষণত 270টা শব্দ কৈছিলে তাৰ মাজত 5 বাৰ মানুহে হৰ্ষত ধ্বনি কৰিছিলে 5 বাৰ হাত চাপৰি বজাইছিলে অন্ত্যেষ্টি ভাষণ, কিন্তু তেওঁৰ ভাষণ ইমান উদ্দীপনাময় মানুহে পাহৰি গ'ল যে আমাৰ এইটো এটা অন্ত্যেষ্টি ভাষণ মাত্ৰ, মানে পাহৰি গ'ল। আচ্ছা বাৰু গ'ল, সেই ভাষণটো হ'ল। মই কৈছো তাৰ লিটাৰী ভেলু আৰু একে সময়তে হিষ্টৰিক ভেলু কেনেকে এটা মিলন ক্ষেত্ৰ হৈছে সেই স্পিচটো। অকল সেয়ে নে, যেতিয়া আমেৰিকাৰ ৰাষ্ট্ৰপতি হ'ল জন এফ কেনেডি, ফিটজেৰাল্ড কেনেডি, তেতিয়া তেওঁৰ যিজন স্পিচ ৰাইটাৰ, সেই স্পিচ ৰাইটাৰজনক ক'লে যে আচ্ছা এটা কথা কোৱাচোন, যে আমি সদায় দেখোন মনত পেলাওঁ আব্ৰাহাম লিংকনৰ ভাষাত, মানে ভাষাটো, সেই সৰু বক্তৃতাটো 270টা শব্দৰ ভাষণটো আমি তেনেকুৱা এটা ভাষণ প্ৰস্তুত কৰিব নোৱাৰোনে? তাৰ আচল ৰহস্যটো কি? বাইদি বাই মই এটা কথা ক'লে ভাল হ'ব বোধহয়। আপোনালোকে জানিব সেই যে 270টা ভাষণতে সেই বাক্য বিখ্যাত কথাটো আছিল, that the government of the people, by the people and for the people shall not perish from this earth. এই কথাটো যে আমি যে কওঁ ডেমক্ৰেসি কি, যে গভৰ্নমেন্ট অফ দি পিপল, বাই দি পিপল, ফৰ দি পিপল, এইটো আহিছে সেই গেটিছবাৰ্গ বক্তৃতাৰ পৰা। 19 নৱেম্বৰ 1863 সেই বক্তৃতাটো দিছিল, সেই তাৰ পৰা সেইটো আহিছে। কিন্তু কেনেডিৰ কথাটো যে সেই ভাষণৰ যাদুকৰী শক্তিটো কি? মাৰ্গাৰেট থেচাৰ, ব্ৰিটিছ প্ৰাইম মিনিষ্টাৰ, তেওঁ যি স্পিচ ৰাইটাৰ ক'লে যে আচ্ছা এটা কথা নহয়, আমি যে সদায় এনেকে ভাষণ দিবলৈ ইমান যত্ন, তেওঁলোকেতো জানে আপোনালোকে যে তেওঁলোকে ভাষণবোৰ যথেষ্ট যত্ন কৰে, প্ৰস্তুত কৰে, তেওঁলোকে গৱেষণা কৰিছিলে। এতিয়া তেওঁৰ ভাষণটো হ'ল 270টা শব্দৰ, কিন্তু সেই ভাষণক গৱেষণা কৰি একোখন কিতাপ ওলাইছে। সেই কিতাপখনত জন কেনেডিৰ যিজন গৱেষক আছিল, স্পিচ ৰাইটাৰ, তেওঁ আছিল থিওডৰ চোৰেনছেন। থিওডৰ চোৰেনছেনে 3টা কথা কৈছিলে যে সেই ভাষণটোৰ মূল শক্তি হ'ল লিংকনে ব্যৱহাৰ কৰা চুটি চুটি শব্দবিলাক, টান শব্দ এটাও নাই সেই ভাষণটো, সেইটো কথা। কিন্তু গেৰী উইলছ বুলি এজন মানুহে এখন কিতাপ লিখিছে সেই ভাষণটোৰ ওপৰত। তেওঁ বহুত গৱেষণা কৰি পাইছে যে সেই চুটি ভাষণটো, চুটি মানে 270টা শব্দৰ সেই ভাষণটোত কি কি আছে? 3টা বস্তুৰ প্ৰভাৱ পৰিছে। 1 নম্বৰ হ'ল গ্ৰীক ৰেটৰিক, ব্যাখ্যা কৰিবলৈ সময় নাই, গ্ৰীক ৰেটৰিক। 2 নম্বৰটো হ'ল সেই সময়ত আমেৰিকাত চিমেটাৰী মুভমেন্ট আছে, সমাধি ক্ষেত্ৰৰ আন্দোলন। তাৰ এটা বেকগ্ৰাউণ্ড আছে, সেইটো চিভিলত মানুহবোৰ ঢুকাইছে, আমাৰ যেনেকে শ্বহীদ স্তম্ভ হৈছে, যে যুদ্ধত মানুহজন ঢুকালে তেওঁক আমি কেনেকে সন্মান জনাওঁ? ঠিক আছে, আমাৰ গাঁৱতে আমি এটা শ্বহীদ স্তম্ভ কৰি তেওঁক সন্মান জনাওঁ, কিবা এটা বিশেষ উদ্দেশ্যত তেওঁৰ জন্ম তিথিত, বিয়োগৰ তিথিত আমি এগছি চাকি জ্বলাওঁ। গতিকে আমেৰিকাত যিটো চিমেটাৰী মুভমেন্ট বুলি কয়, ৰুৰেল এলেকাত হৈছিলে, সেই তাৰ প্ৰভাৱ আছে। আৰু 3 নম্বৰ হৈছে কি, যে কি কয়, আব্ৰাহাম লিংকনৰ আধ্যাত্মিক আৰু ৰাজনৈতিক চিন্তাৰ প্ৰতিফলন। এই 3টাৰ প্ৰভাৱ তাত দেখিছে। গতিকে এতিয়া আমি জানিব লাগিব যে বহুত সময়ত ইতিহাস আৰু সাহিত্যক আমি বেলেগ বস্তু বুলি চাব নোৱাৰো। এনেকুৱা কিছুমান পইণ্টছ আছে, যেনে বায়োগ্ৰাফি, এনেকুৱা কিছুমান হিষ্টৰিক মমেণ্টছ আছে য'ত সাহিত্য আৰু ইতিহাস একাকাৰ হৈ গৈছে, একেলগ হৈ গৈছে। আৰু সেইকাৰণে আমি সদায় ইতিহাসৰ যিসকল ছাত্ৰ, আমি সদায় সাহিত্য আমাৰ কিমান দূৰ সমল হিচাপে ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিব পাৰো, আমি সেইটো প্ৰতি সদায় যত্নবান। মই নিজে গৱেষণাৰ ক্ষেত্ৰতো সেইটো ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছো। মই মামনি ৰয়ছম গোস্বামীৰ সাগব কামৰূপ, সাউথ কামৰূপ, সেইখন মই ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিলো। মই ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিলো প্ৰেমচন্দৰ গোদান উপন্যাসখন। মানুহৰ দাৰিদ্ৰ কি, গাঁৱৰ দাৰিদ্ৰৰ কি ৰূপ, সেইটো বুজিবৰ কাৰণে গোদান উত্তম। কাষ্ট চিষ্টেম বা বৰ্ণ বিভেদ প্ৰস্তাৰ কিমান কৰুণ পৰিণতি হ'ব পাৰে সেইটো বুজিবৰ কাৰণে গোদান, মই সেইটো ব্যৱহাৰ কৰিছিলো। সেইকাৰণে মই ভাবো যে ইতিহাস আৰু সাহিত্য যদিও দুইটা বেলেগ বস্তু, পৰস্পৰৰ মাজত দুইটাৰ সম্পৰ্ক আছে, আৰু সেই সম্পৰ্ক ৰক্ষা কৰি আৰু আমি নিজৰ ধৰ্মটো ৰক্ষা কৰি পেলাই সাহিত্য, ধৰ্ম, মই ধৰ্ম কৈছো একাডেমিক অৰ্থত ধৰ্ম, সেই কথাটো আমি চাব লাগিব। আমি যদি বহুত থিয়ৰি সোমাই দিওঁ, ধৰি লওক আমাৰ পাণ্ডিত্য হয়তো জাহিৰ হ'ব, কিন্তু সি হিষ্ট্ৰী নহ'ব। কাৰণ একেটা উপাদান, এতিয়া ধৰি লওক আপোনালোকে জানে, মই এটা সৰু উদাহৰণ দিওঁ, যে চাউলৰ পৰা তাৰ বেছিক উপাদানটো হ'ল চাউল। সেই চাউলৰ পৰা আপুনি ভাতো কৰিব পাৰে, সেই চাউলৰ পৰা আপুনি বিৰিয়ানীও কৰিব পাৰে। কিন্তু বিৰিয়ানীটো বিৰিয়ানী, ভাতটো ভাত। গতিকে হিষ্ট্ৰী যদি হিষ্ট্ৰী হ'ব লাগে, তেতিয়াহ'লে তাক যদি ভাত বুলি ক'ব খোজে, তাক ভাত কৰি থওক। আৰু যদি আপুনি হিষ্ট্ৰীটো বিৰিয়ানী কৰিব খুজিছে, তেতিয়াহ'লে আপুনি বিৰিয়ানী কৰক, তাক ভাত বুলি নক'ব। বাৰু মই সমুখে হলো মোৰ যিখিনি চিন্তা সেইখিনি আপোনালোকৰ লগত শ্বেয়াৰ কৰিলো আসলতে এনেকুৱা মানে অনলাইন ব্যৱস্থাত আমি ইন্টাৰেক্ট কৰাৰ স্কোপ খুব কম সময় আমাৰ নাথাকে এনেকুৱা মই ভাবো যে কেতিয়াবা ভাল দিন আহিলে আমি দেখা দেখি হ'ম তেতিয়া কথাবোৰ আলোচনা কৰিম মুকলিভাৱে আলোচনা কৰিম মই আকৌ সাহিত্য একাডেমিক ধন্যবাদ জনাইছো এনেকৈ দুআষাৰ কথা হ'বৰ কাৰণে সুবিধা দিয়াৰ কাৰণে ধন্যবাদ थैंक यू डेविड जी
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद प्रोफेसर राजेंद्र सैकिया जी बहुत ही सुंदर वक्तव्य आपने दिया और मित्रों अब कार्यक्रम के अंत में मैं आमंत्रित कर रहा हूं डॉक्टर चंदन शर्मा जी को डॉक्टर चंदन शर्मा जी डिब्रूगढ़ यूनिवर्सिटी में इतिहास विभाग के विभागाध्यक्ष हैं और एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर हैं चंदन शर्मा जी ने इस कार्यक्रम को परिकल्पित करने में भी काफी महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाई मैं आमंत्रित कर रहा हूं डॉक्टर चंदन शर्मा जी
I would like to thank Sahitya Akademi and now continuing with the whole discussion relating to history and literature. The first point I would like to make, which was discussed in in one volume of Public Culture Journal relating to public life of history. Now the basic point is that history as a discipline, it has two lives. One is its disciplinary life and one is its public life. Now when you try to understand what is disciplinary life is exactly in the first half of what was being narrated or discussed by Professor Rajen Saikia, that disciplinary life of history is dominated by the professional historians who are trained to write history, methodological history, basically done through research in the universities, colleges, and the academic institutions. Now, what is public history? Now, public life of history, interestingly, is not always determined only by professional history or professional historians. Public life of history is mostly being determined by popular historical writings. It may be stories, it might be novels, it might be different kinds of dramatical works, poems, performances, it might be popular historical articles. So these popular historiography, this particular genre mostly determines what we know as public life of history. Now, having said that, let me try to understand or make certain points specifically relating to the importance of historical novels, specifically in early 20th century, which were part and parcel of the whole national project or the project of Assamese nationalism. Now, theoreticians of nationalism, they have always reinforced the importance played by history, historical imagination, historical text in the projection of nation, in the making of nations and nationalism, and specifically nationalism as a particular uniting bond which had been always there since very early period, from the pre-modern period. That a linear understanding of history, a linear understanding of a particular identity of nation or nationalism, that can be converted in the public imagination only by history. And here, it is not the disciplinary history. It is basically the popular historiography, the genre of popular historiography, which determines this particular aspect, that they become part and parcel of the nation-making project. Now, before saying that, Professor Nandana Datta, as well as Rakhi Moral Baido, both of them, they have been discussing about Hayden White, and that Hayden White, how he projected that history writing was more or less in the 19th century. It was written in the dominant tropes. Now, here I would like to quote Nicholas Dirks. He had a very interesting point. He said, Hayden White's structuralist forms of arguments identified some of the tropes of history's 19th century imaginary and rhetoric, but ignored what seems to be the most important, obvious trope of all, the nation itself. That means that the whole project of history writing in the modern period, it is the idea of a nation, nation state, and nationalism that is the dominant trope all over the world. And as modern history writing disseminated to the colonies, as ideas of nations and nationalism also disseminated to the nationalism, and it gained expansion through the anti-colonial struggles and movements across India. So the whole project of making up nationalism and history writing, and also the new project of writing novels, early Assamese novels, they got entwined. Now, as I was speaking about public life of history, if we try to understand the making of popular history, or the what we can call the new historical consciousness, a new nationalist historical consciousness, which was emerging from the late 19th century and specifically from the early 20th century, we find that the whole nationalist imagination, it was moving around the life and accomplishments of Lasit Borphukan, Joymoti, Mulaga Bhoru, Silarai, which were chosen from the medieval history of Assam, and whose new nationalist narratives were created and popularized through popular articles, drama, poems, and songs, and they became part of the new nationalist folklore in the pre-independent period. My maternal anger is not greater than my place of birth. This did not come from the Buronjis or the chronicles or any historical documents. This basically was directly produced from literary pieces. But this becomes the most important dominant imagination, what you can call the public life of history. So this public life of history was not determined by what was the chronicles written about. They were writing about the whole stories, whole history of Saraighat, Battle of Saraighat, where the Mughals were being defeated. On the contrary, the whole new idea, consciousness about the Battle of Saraighat and the accomplishments of Lasit, it basically came up from the early 20th century through this particular, mostly the dramatical works which were performed, poems, smaller historical articles, mostly by this popular genre and mostly by literature. So that's why in the process of dissemination of Assamese nationalism, a new historical consciousness, the most important role was played by the historical novels and the historical drama. The public life of history and historical consciousness in Assam in this period was determined by the historical awareness and historical sense as defined by the emerging genre of historical literature. Doyens of Assamese literature in this period consciously and concertedly were engaged in the production of historical literature to promote nationalist favors among the people. In the initial period of colonization, the educated middle class anchored in the cities repudiated the folk traditions and the folk life as a part of the discredited past, the past which was painted dark by colonialism. But in the period of national fervor, these folk traditions emerged as a source of pride and identity, which were unadulterated by colonial modernity. In the period of nationalism, folk traditions were explored, connected, printed, so that this can reach a wider audience. The middle class, in the first half of the 19th century, being imbibed by Victorian sensibility, were trying to disengage from the popular and plebeian domains of culture, specifically Bihu, as it happened in other parts of India in the same period. But the emergence of regional feelings expedited the process to look back to the roots and the source and preservation of the local traditions. Folk literature became a mission for the middle class towards the end of the 19th century. And here we can find the importance of Bej Barua in popularizing Bihu through his own writings. And here is a departure from the mid-19th century Assamese intellectuals and the late 19th century, early 20th century Assamese intellectuals. And the main trope was the whole writing in the trope of nationalism. So the changing perspective of Assamese middle class towards folk and village life were represented in the Assamese journal Junaki. This new engagement with the traditional culture, folk and village life became visible in the historical novels. Padmanath Gohain Borua was one of the pioneers of historical novels in Assam, and his first novel was Bhanumati. The socio-political background of this novel was Muamori uprising of the late 18th century. Now, these Muamori uprising and the Burmese invasion, they were the background around which most of the early Assamese novels, the stories revolved. And interestingly, these novels, they determine the new popular consciousness, the historical consciousness throughout the 20th century. Specifically in the early part of the 20th century, they became the part of the memory. That this memory did not directly flow from the continuity of the 19th century memory. On the contrary, this new memory about the whole destruction, desolation, and the disintegration of the Ahom state and the problems which was around the Muamori rebellion and the Burmese invasion, this new memory was created through these historical novels. Now, his next novel, Lahori, was based on the political turmoil created by the Burmese invasions. In both the novels, the misgovernance of Shiva Singha and Queen Phuleshwari is narrated to be the main cause of the turmoil, which ultimately led to the downfall of the Ahom state. Lakshmanath Bezbara's Podum Kori engaged with the Dondua Druh, the rebellion in Kamrup during the Muamori rebellion. The accomplished historian who became popular due to the historical novels was Rajnikanta Bordoloi. He has to written some historical pieces, as well as his main domain was historical novels. His Monomoti, which was published in 1900, also deals with Burmese invasion. The novel is replete with references to the village, folk life, and rituals in Assam. The novel includes a picturesque description of the Daul Utsav of Borpeta, the Kirtan Ghar, and the life of the Satras. Now, this is very interesting because intentionally, Bordoloi, when he was writing these novels, he was trying to put in the cultural aspects of Assam, because he knew at his best that the whole project of nation was only in the making. That people of Assam did not know exactly what was happening from Hodia to Dhuburi in different regions of Assam. So the people have to be made aware. They must know what is happening around Borpeta. They must know what is happening around Sibsagar. They must know the cultural aspect of village life in Kamrup. So that's why the cultural aspects were brought in, and in such a way, a new cultural history. And that new cultural history, the memory of that became a part of the public memory of historical consciousness through these novels. That's why in the whole making of nationalism and the project of nationalist culture, emergence of a one composite nationalism, here is the importance of these particular Assamese novels. Now, he also recreated the story of Dondua Druh in his novel titled Dondua Druh. Here also he deals with the rich traditional folk performance of Kamrup quite profusely. His most interesting novel was Rongili, 1925. Bordoloi inserted some pedagogic passages to make the audience aware of the various aspects of Bihu celebration and how it was important for the national life of the Assamese people. He inserted one particular chapter, Bihu Ki, and he said, if someone knows what is Bihu, they can skip this particular chapter. Now, why this particular Bihu, an essay was inserted into that particular novel? Because in 1925, till the whole debate was not concluded, what should be the national culture of Assam? Should it be Durga Puja or should it be Bihu? Bihu came to be settled only as a national festival only in the 30s. So the point is clear that exactly the national culture which was emerging gradually, that was not known to all the people of Assam from Hodia to Dhuburi. That's why it has to be done. It has to be done through a project. And so the project of novel writing, in that particular novel writing project, was also a project of nationalist project to make the people aware about the different cultures. So that's why here comes Bihu Ki. What is Bihu? So the detailed description of Bihu was inserted within the story of the novel with a clear intention to make the people public aware of the importance of Bihu in national life of Assam. In this process, he also recreated some events of Bihu celebration in Ronghar, the capital of Ahoms, where the compound of the Ronghar Bakori, becomes the central Bihu celebration, center of Bihu celebration, with royal support and patronage. In this new nationalist memory of Bihu as a national culture of Assamese people, the centrality of the Ronghar as the image of pre-colonial Bihu celebration was created by Bordoloi in this novel. the impact of these novels and the newspapers in the imagination of the nation, according to Benedict Anderson, was the emergence of the new idea of a homogeneous and empty time, which was characteristically different from the medieval concept of a simultaneity, a long time. And moreover, here also comes, we can use the term used by Hobson to understand invention of tradition in the making of nationalist purposes. Now, this centrality of Ronghor and the Bihu celebration, according to Padmeshwar Gogoi, this basically came directly from the novel of Bordoloi, and he said that later on, Leela Gogoi and other writers, they basically continued, which basically appears in that particular novel. So this centrality of Ronghor and the Bihu and that celebration was basically recreated through a novel, later on became part of a public memory, and now it becomes an indelible memory where you cannot disassociate it. It now becomes a part of the whole continuous memory, as that Bihu was even celebrated in the Ronghor Bakori, even in the pre-colonial period, in the days of the Ahom rulers. So this can be termed as some kind of a invention of tradition. And this, as I said, I took it from one particular article written by Padmeshwar Gogoi in Kotha Guwahati Journal, which was titled as Tahanir Bihu or Ajir Bihu. Now, Partha Chatterjee, in his discussions on pedagogy of culture, has stated that out of the different forms of cultural production that were deployed in the colonial, that were deployed in period to spread modernity and nationalism, theater had a far broader reach than either of the novels or the newspapers. The comparative strength of theater medium was due to its reach to a wider audience, which was not restricted only to the newly emerging reading public. From the end of the 19th century and in the first decades of the 20th century, we see a consistent and spirited endeavor on the part of the Assamese middle class to strive for maintaining the original cultural idiom of the land, rooted in its own rich history, and to sweep out the Bengali influence in the fields of drama, literature, cultural performance, puja celebrations, etc. Ambika Gai Raichuduri, Khudra Kumar Bhuiya, and other leading personalities of the Assamese intelligentsia were highly imbibed by the spirit of the regeneration of Assamese culture and the need to maintain cultural exclusiveness in the region, even in their student days. They insisted to promote Assamese theatre, as by the end of the 19th century, drama was becoming more popular throughout Assam. The popular taste for Bengali drama in Assam was criticized by Bezburua in his drama Numal, where he showed the vanity of one Sottradhikar who expressed his pride for writing a Bengali drama himself, and for him that was much better than the Assamese Onkiya Bhauna. In the initial period, the dramatic works of the Assamese middle class were concerned with the message of social reform, and this reflected in the Ram Navami written by Guna Viram Borua and in the Kaniyar Kirtan written by Hamchandra Borua. Now, the dialogues of the heroes and the heroines in the new kind of a drama, historical drama, which was emerging since the early part of the 20th century, in this new kind of dramatical works, the dialogues of the heroes and heroines were full of patriotic messages, and the politics of the early 20th century Assam determined the employment and the narration of the stories presented in drama forms. Such historical dramas became hugely popular in the early 20th century, and most of these were promoted across Assam. These performances helped in spreading the language of nationalism among the common people, and in the process also created a new historical consciousness. Lakshminath Bezburua wrote Chakradhar Singha, Belimar, Joymoti Kori, and Godadhar Raja. Padmanath Gohai Borua wrote Joymoti, Godadhar, Hadhoni, Lasit Borfukan. Namin Chandra Bordoloi also wrote Joymoti, but it was not published. Radhakanta Hendrik wrote Mulaga Boru, Otul Chandra Hazarika, Matri Pujat, Mumai Boli, then Bir Puja, Kuranga Noyani in the same period. Nokul Chandra Bhuiya wrote Jerengar Hoti in 1924, Chandra Kanto Hinga in 1931, and Bidruhi Moran. These dramatical literature successfully recreated the medieval heroes and heroines as like real life characters who could inspire the Assamese people in the struggle for nationalist aspirations. it is rightly said that the fact that interpretation of the past and political interests are influencing each other does not really reflect a disruption of historical culture. On the contrary, it represents its driving force. It was stated by Gottlob. Now, this was the making of the historical literature, which basically determined, as I said, the public life of history. Now, things were gradually changing in the post-independent period, and as it has been rightly being pointed out in his introduction in the translation of Jongam by Amit Rahul Boisya, that the post-1947 historical novels, they were mostly can be termed basically as post-nationalist historical novels. And I am just reading out Amit Rahul Boisya quoted from Ila Sohat's work, where she said that post-nationalist texts or films call attention to the fault lines of gender, class, ethnicity, region, partition, migration, and exile. And exactly in the post-1947 period, new kind of historical literature emerged. And in this particular aspect, I would just like to point out few works like Kunu Khed Nai. It can be translated, it is not translated, but it can be translated as there's no remorse. Kunu Khed Nai is basically revolves around the 18th century, about the period of decline of the Ahom rule. It was written by Padma Barkatoki. But it was, the narrative was about Kunu Khed Nai, no remorse. It was some kind of inevitability because there was already dissension, decline, and it led to inevitable disintegration of the Ahom state. So Kunu Khed Nai, no remorse. Now a different narrative was weaved around within the same period, and that is Lila Gogo's Beli Margol, sunset. Beli Margol, it's a sunset of the Ahom state. So this is a new narrative. Now it also revolves around the same period, but it is more about a sympathetic reading about the Ahom history from the 18th century and in the 19th century. The whole importance of historical novels is in the creation of the whole feelings, the trauma, the problems of the people, which cannot be reached or which cannot be explored by the professional historians in their strive to revolve around literary sources, written sources, primary sources. And that's why there was always a problem to write history of trauma, history of sufferings, how to write history of sufferings, history of trauma, history of violence. And that's why India had to wait till the writings of Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin to understand the problems of partition. And they basically recreated that particular history through a new methodology, where the most important part was from collecting oral narratives. The dominant narrative is the oral narrative, through which the trauma of the partition, it was brought alive. And that's why for a long period of time it was being said that the social history of partition was available only in literature, because that social history of partition which should deal with the trauma, the rupture, which could not be touched by historians. Official historians basically was revolving around only high history of politics, but the suffering of the common people, this was dealt with only by the literature. And that's why it was being coined that social history of partition was available only in literature. Now in Assam, interestingly, in 1981, posthumously, the novel Jongam, Debendranath Acharya's novel, his earlier two novels, Onnojuk Onnopurukh and Kal Purukh. Onnojuk Onnopurukh is revolved around the 19th century and Kal Purukh around 17th century. But his new novel, which was published posthumously, Jongam, it was narrating the migration of people at the time of the takeover of Burma by the Japanese forces, and the suffering of the people who had to flee from the difficult terrains in the Patkai ranges, and where thousands of people died. Now this kind of novel, the depiction of the reality of the sufferings of the people, that could be possible because he could get in touch with the oral narratives of those people. When he was in England for his higher studies, he basically collected some of those narratives, and he could successfully employ in a very successful historical novel in Jongam, where he depicts the sufferings of the people who had to traverse difficult terrains, starvation, pain, death in that particular area, and some of them who could successfully reach up to Lidu. So that particular novel, he could recreate it because his methodology was a different one. He could understand it from the sufferings of the people, and he could collect some of the oral narratives. And that's why a very successful historical novel was being recreated. Now let me here bring in the importance of listening to different voices when you try to understand post-national novels. Here I would like to quote Simamanda Adichie. She said in a very interesting TED talk, she said, the single story creates stereotype, and the problems with stereotype is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have to be used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair the broken dignity. When we reject a single story, when you realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of a paradise. Now, if we try to understand the history of Assam movement, now lots of history is coming up about Nelly historical writings have also come up. Now, the most important, that public imagination, it is more or less determined by a very famous song of Bhupen Hazarika. It speaks about Jue Pura Tiraki, Nirvasani Botor, Mur Bhaitu Nuha Hol, Paone Hobor. He basically said that in that traumatic time of 1983, where everything was burnt, Jue Pura, and when you hear that particular song, you can really smell that pura, everything is burnt. And he said that his younger brother is lost, he has vanished, because he was suffering, because he was protesting. He did not want to be an outsider in his own place. So that is the voice of the autochthon, and that is the voice of the dominant Assamese nationalist writings. Mur Bhaitu Nuha Hol, Jarone Khobor. So this is something which speaks about the nationalist Assamese mainstream voice. Now, at the same time, if we try to have the other side of the story, that one particular very powerful story, it was written by Abdul Malik, Pura Gaon Pohila Bohag. It was translated as spring showers in a burnt village. Again, burnt village, Pura, where a minority community, they suffered a lot because of the clashes, and how they could rekindle their hope, because there was some kind of a new showers, and they start to rebuild their hope. They start to rebuild their villages. So these are the two sides of the story. We need multiple stories. And perhaps if historians read these particular stories, they can have a more empathic understanding of the past. Otherwise, this becomes just chronicles of celebrations of nationalism, or of nationalist stories, or ethnic stories, or ethnic movements. If we try to understand history of ethnic movements, we must try to read Orupia Potongia Kolitas Helani. Helani speaks about these problems of the traumatic people, how the women suffered. And if we don't try to understand the history of people from that particular Helani, then perhaps only documentary history cannot reach out to the trauma and suffering of the people, which was happening from the late 80s and early 90s. And that's why we need two kinds of stories, multiple stories. Here is an important novel recently written by Anamika Bora. It's Ostitto. Ostitto is all about Ostitto Hongram. Everyone speaks in Assam about that is our identity issue, Ostitto, our existence. And we had struggled so much of different movements because of to maintain our own identity, our own existence, Ostitto Hongram. And she beautifully writes a novel around that particular problem of demographic change, the coming of the Bengal Muslim peasantry, and the tensions and the conflicts. Now, we must also try to hear the voice as it appears in Abdul Samad's novel, Bon Kukurar Dak. It was pointed out to me in a seminar by Dr. Dhruvosti Bobora, Bon Kukurar Dak. Now, if we read Bon Kukurar Dak and Ostitto, then we can understand the two sides of the story, multiple stories. And by reading these multiple stories, perhaps historians can try to understand the problems around, and we can try to humanize our own understanding and to write something where people can really matter. Same thing can be told in even some of the novels of the pre-partition period, pre-independent period. Take for example, here I can mention the Miriziori, written by Bordole himself, where some kind of a very reciprocal and symmetric relationship exists between the missing community and the Assamese Hindus. But this was but we don't find the similar narrative in Vishnu Rabha's small novella, Missing Koneng, where he does not represent this particular a very fine balance of reciprocal and symmetric relationship in between the Assamese caste Hindus and the missing community. And that's why if we read these two together, we can have a different understanding, and perhaps our historical sensibility can also we can fine tune it. We can explore the two different sides of the historical processes. Now, let me end here by just mentioning one particular, now we can say, oral historian who recently got Nobel Award in 1915, and she is Svetlana Alexievich. Svetlana Alexievich. She got Nobel in 2015 for her writings. Second-hand time. It basically deals with the trauma, the suffering, the confidence of the people in Soviet Russia in 70s and 80s. At the time of the disintegration of Soviet Russia, she could explore the suffering of the people, at the same time the confidence of the common people, by weaving together multiple oral narratives. And these oral narratives can be read even as a fiction, but this is a real stories happening around the common people. The same thing revolves around in her other writings, like Boys in Zinc. Boys in Zinc speaks about the sufferings of the Soviet Russian soldiers in Afghanistan when Soviet soldiers entered into Afghanistan in 1979, and they had to suffer huge loss. And exactly what happened to those soldiers and what happened to those families of those particular soldiers who suffered. And she weaves together multiple oral narratives, and through these oral narratives, she creates a new genre of writing which can be placed together in between history and literature, whereas that what-rated division, it gets blurred. Anyway, the whole distinct division in between literature and history, it was a post-Enlightenment product. It got fine-tuned in early part of the 19th century, but it was questioned at the time of the postmodernist criticism of history writing. But whatever it is, the postmodernist attack on history writing, specifically history discipline's immense fate to speak about the truth, it has helped the historian to question about the different sources, to question about the motivations, the motives, the interest of those particular projects to maintain those sources. So we have become much more aware about the problems of the sources. Anyway, if we can read in both ways, history and literature, historians can learn a lot. At the same time, there can be more explorations for the literary persons. As I said, as Jubada also said, I had written something about his own novel, Ajar. I don't want to speak a lot about the Ajar, but one particular point, here comes the whole, he successfully explores the whole medical archives, weaves together in a very interesting story of intergenerations from the late 18th century up till 1947, which makes it a very successful historical novel, and where he can go beyond the archive. When he can go beyond the archive, Dr. Bora's creative and imaginative engagement as a creative writer helped him to transcend the limitations and the constraints of the archive to unravel the emotional history of suffering, loss, and trauma. The social history of partition of India was addressed only in literature. In the same, Derrida, in his work on archive favor, explored these constraints of the archive and denied to go for any concrete definition of the term archive. For him, archive is only a notion, an impression associated with a word which exists only as an anticipation of a loss of history. regarding this understanding of Derrida about the archive. Butler, he had written that the archive for Derrida marks as a space of anxiety, precisely an anxiety about the possibility of the loss of history. Azar is a historical novel, is aware about the fragmented and incomplete nature of the archival sources, which has to be retrieved through a historical imagination to tell an epic story of Assam through the private and public life of 4 generations of family from the end of the 18th century till independence. I have already exceeded my time, and not only that, even our whole symposium has exceeded its time. It was supposed to end by 12:30. Anyway, I thank everyone for your patient listening. Thank you.
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद डॉक्टर चंदन शर्मा जी। मित्रों, आज का यह परिसंवाद, यह सिंपोजियम बहुत ही फ्रूटफुल रहा है। मैं देख रहा हूं कि YouTube पर हमें जो है बहुत सारी प्रतिक्रियाएं मिली हैं और लगातार 50 से ज्यादा दर्शक श्रोता हमारे बीच उपस्थित रहे हैं और लोगों ने जो है इस तरह की प्रतिक्रिया दी है कि जो असमिया साहित्य के जो छात्र ऐतिहासिक उपन्यासों पर या ऐतिहासिक इतिहास के पृष्ठभूमि लिए लेखन पर शोध करना चाहते हैं, उनके लिए यह परिसंवाद बहुत ही लाभदायक रहा है। मैं आज के इस कार्यक्रम में शामिल सभी प्रतिभागियों का अकादमी की तरफ से धन्यवाद कहना चाहूंगा। डॉक्टर ध्रुव ज्योति बोरा, डॉक्टर नंदना दत्त, डॉक्टर रजीउद्दीन अकील साहब, डॉक्टर राखी कलिता मोराल, डॉक्टर राजेंद्र सैकिया, डॉक्टर चंदन कुमार शर्मा और साहित्य अकादमी के सचिव डॉक्टर के श्रीनिवास राव, आप सभी का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। जो श्रोता हैं हमारे, जो दर्शक हैं YouTube के, उनसे अनुरोध होगा कि आप हमारे इस कार्यक्रम के लिंक को अधिक से अधिक शेयर करें ताकि ज्यादा से ज्यादा लोग इस कार्यक्रम का लाभ उठा सकें। और अकादमी के कार्यक्रम लगातार अन्य भाषाओं में भी, बहुभाषी रूप में भी, असमिया के भी कार्यक्रम, अंग्रेजी के भी कार्यक्रम लगातार हो रहे हैं। प्रत्येक महीने हम लोग 50 के आसपास कार्यक्रम कर रहे हैं। रोज ही 2 या 3 कार्यक्रम हमारे आयोजित होते हैं YouTube पर, जो सीधे प्रसारित होते हैं। आप सबकी रुचि जिन भी कार्यक्रमों में हो उसको आप जरूर देखें। इसी अनुरोध के साथ पुनः एक बार आप सबों का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। नमस्कार।